the story begins its exciting development. The narration focuses readers' attention on the character who makes the score. Here is the number 1034 changed to 1035. Apparently, he was doing some kind of exercise. The audience could draw such a conclusion based on the fact that the hero raised both hands up and clapped them. In the next episode, it became known that the action was carried out inside a building, where sunlight fell and illuminated the interior space. Among him, you could see several characters who surrounded one without clothes. The guys were in a fairly large room, which was filled with various furniture, school chairs and tables, large tanks and signs. The overweight guy was doing physical exercises. He jumped up and clapped his hands, while simultaneously keeping score, which went from 1036 to 1037. There was a wall behind him, so, apparently, they were on the porch or entrance to the building, the road to which was equipped with large gray stone slabs. Finally, the story introduced readers to this somewhat mysterious character. As it turned out, his name was Cha Mu-yeol. He had black hair that was parted on the left side. The long side slightly covered his thick eyebrows, which on this episode gave him an excited appearance. The next picture was about how two guys filmed a character with excess weight. There was an evil grin on their smiles. The first of them, who had brown hair with long bangs that covered his forehead, burst out laughing and said out loud that everyone around him should look at the shaking legs of their buddy. The second hero picked up the joyful and malicious mood of his friend and, also through laughter, said that in any case, in his personal opinion, it was quite a funny sight. Suddenly, the overweight character fell to his feet and began to pitifully swallow air in order to restore the breathing that had strayed from excessive load on his body. Cha Mu-yeol lowered his head and searched afterwards. He was so tired that readers could see his heavy breaths and exhalations. The guys who were standing in a pile opposite him stared questioningly. One of them put his hands in his pockets and uttered a strange sound that conveyed his surprise or bewilderment. The other, who was sitting, had black hair that was cut in the shape of a pot, swiftly flashed his evil gaze in the direction of Cha Mu-yeol, and the third just opened his mouth and watched him. According to the following episode, a stranger took a step on the gray stone slabs and laughed. In his opinion, the situation was similar to the fact that a guy who fell to the floor and was breathing heavily from physical activity was in trouble because he was overweight, to which he made it clear that he could still continue. The boy lowered his head dejectedly, watching the speaker from under his brows, who was already standing in front of his face, which was completely wet with sweat. The stranger had brown hair neatly parted on the left. Apparently, as readers could assume, there were schoolchildren in front of them, because this guy was wearing black pants and a gray t-shirt, over which he was wearing a white long-sleeve shirt. He gave a negative answer to the guy he was looking down on, and said that, in his opinion, it was obvious that he was experiencing difficulties. Moreover, after a short period of time, the character asked him a question. The guy was interested in whether he had a desire to lose weight, although the tone of his voice gave the impression that he insisted on it more, as if it was not even a request, but an incentive to action. In the next episode, a schoolboy with a terrible character put a bucket with unknown contents in front of Cha Mu-yeol. Aloud he uttered his request, although from his words it was an instruction or a wish, according to which the guy would have to eat again. His gaze was definitely serious, his black eyes were like an abyss, and the shadow that fell on the upper part of his face emphasized the expression of facial expressions, which allowed readers to compare him with a predator that hunted its prey. The schoolboy watched his interlocutor expectantly, and after a short period of time, I told him to start eating. Why did he get everything in his eyes? Large drops of sweat trickled down Cha Mu-yeol's face, and the irises of the eyes almost disappeared altogether because the whites filled the surface, which only emphasized the frightened expression of the guy's face, who continued to breathe heavily. The corners of his eyes drooped involuntarily, and in the next episode, the character even pulled both of his hands, which were shaking because they were approaching the unknown contents of the iron bucket, when suddenly unknown sounds were heard. However, readers could not discern what exactly Cha Mu-yeol was doing, because his silhouette was hidden by the tall figure of one of the schoolchildren. That's just the audience was shown his wide-open eyes, on which large tears began to appear. Suddenly, other guys entered the dialogue. One of them, a guy with brown hair pulled back in different directions, covered his mouth with his right hand and said through a terrible laugh that it was just disgusting. His friend, the hero with the black hair in the form of a pot and in a blue jacket, picked up the mood of the others and also burst into laughter, when suddenly the chief of them pushed Cha Mu-yeol so hard that he flew back, opening his mouth in surprise and an involuntary sigh. The others approached the fallen guy and gave him a threatening order to continue eating the strange contents that were in the iron bucket. The student began to cry and silently continued to listen to the guys and wait for what they would do next in relation to him. He tried to cover his head with both hands, probably hiding his tears in this way, and mentally asked for forgiveness. Two characters stood over the overweight boy while the other two filmed what they were doing on the phone. In the next frame, the story tells readers about the thoughts of Cha Mu-yeol. As it became known, from the very moment of his birth, he considered himself unworthy and owed something to others, as if the guy was different from his peers. He was crying, always, and the reason was that his entourage thought the same way. But everything has changed. As the new episode shows, the main character has changed a lot, and even for the better. There was no longer an overweight guy. Now he had a toned and muscular body, and all because he pulled himself together and started playing sports. For example, Cha Mu-yeol puts his left hand back and tries to make a swinging motion. On his face, which was wet with sweat, his black eyebrows were strained, which gave him a concentrated appearance. The main character made a firm decision to conquer this world. When suddenly, in the next episode, he suddenly opened his eyes, as if waking up from some kind of dream. After a short period of time, it became clear to readers that everyone had come up with this, although they could make a rather audacious assumption that this was his goal, because they were shown the same chubby schoolboy who fell again, thanks to which he had just not made one serious mistake. The guy sat down and began to think about what he had just almost done. Large drops of sweat appeared on his face, because he understood that it was as if fate had saved him by giving him another chance. A chance to change everything. His snow-white skin has acquired red spots from indignation and misunderstanding. He cast a serious look down while simultaneously asking aloud what had just happened. Cha Mu-yeol cursed at the top of his voice, trying to come to a sober state in this way. As it turned out, the first thought that settled in his mind told him that the main character had just risen from the dead. He raised both hands and watched them. When suddenly his silhouette appeared from above behind him, only he was different from him. This Cha Mu-yeol was muscular and slender. Apparently, he joined the soul of an MMA athlete. The next episode tells curious readers about a fierce fight between two wrestlers. One of them, a man with dark hair shaved at the temples and the back of his head, and with an overgrown beard, dealt a crushing blow to his opponent. He was fighting a single combat with a character who was slightly below him. Due to a rough push, this guy turned his head slightly because his opponent managed to hit him. However, it did not prevent readers from describing him as a dark-haired handsome man. Suddenly, the referee's voice rang out, who announced that a very strong blow from Makhmudov had been taken by Cha Mu-yeol, but they gave him advice so that the guy would continue to keep in the same spirit and not focus attention on it. The big ring was brightly lit, making even the spectators behind it could not be seen because they were immersed in darkness. However, they continued to twist with all the might of their voice the words of support in relation to their favorites. As it turned out, according to the referee of the duel, the main character really managed to improve his defense. Readers could also notice this, because despite the fact that Makhmudov continued to deliver crushing blows at a rapid pace, he failed to break him. Cha Mu-yeol stood like a wall. Not even a single muscle on his back tensed from their intensity and strength. Suddenly, in the next episode, the main character's opponent made an uppercut on the left this time. The referee was still commenting on the actions in the ring, with the help of which readers could familiarize themselves with the terminology of the fights. Makhmudov managed to slow down Cha Mu-yeol slightly, because he, holding both hands at the ready, raised his head up, trying to dodge in this way. That's just the judge said that the guy got hit in the jaw. Now the main character stood in a protective pose, turning his head to the right side and covering it with both hands, which he raised, thus opening a view of the unprotected torso. At the next moment, Makhmudov did not think for long, because he began to attack. After that, the referee again informed the curious fans of this fight that the fighter continued to beat Cha Mu-yeol without a break. Suddenly, the pumped-up athlete lunged forward, causing a small stream of air to rise behind his hind leg, which provoked the movement of dust. Makhmudov dealt a crushing blow to the main character, severely wounding him. He, in turn, did not have time to react or group properly, so he just started falling backwards. Readers could see the blood on his face, which began to flow smoothly through his body. The story described his glass eyes, the iris and pupil of which began to rise smoothly upwards. Apparently, the man stopped understanding something. Cha Mu-yeol imagined how he, the judge, raised his left hand in a gesture that he had won, from which a bright and radiant smile appeared on the face of the main character. Even readers could notice and note for themselves that a gold medal hung on his chest. As it became known after a short period of time, the man wished with all his heart to become the strongest. In the next episode, he and another character with gray hair took photos, posing for her and hugging. It was the signing of an exclusive contract with Cha Mu-yeol. And in the new picture, the main character dealt a crushing blow to his opponent using his left hand. And he succeeded. According to his thought processes, the guy always believed that he could do it. Suddenly, the story began to tell again around the duel between him and Makhmudov, allowing once again to show how beautifully the second man won by hitting him in the jaw. Why did Cha Mu-yeol freeze, opening his eyes wide and relaxing his mouth? In his opinion, it was a fatal weakness. And she finally opened up. That's just all that readers have just seen was a dream. The main character folded both hands on the school desk and suddenly raised his head. His mouth was drooling, and he asked a question out loud. He was interested in what had just happened and whether he had missed anything important. An aura thickened around him, as if the guy had just done something forbidden. He was dressed in a school uniform, which consisted of a white shirt, a gray vest with a black tie and a jacket. In the next episode, the picture took him from a larger angle, allowing him to see the reaction of his neighbor, a guy with long black bangs that covered his forehead. However, this did not prevent the audience from seeing a puzzled expression of facial expressions on his face. He looked at his classmate and closely followed his actions. But Cha Mu-yeol was trying to come to his senses at that moment. At first, the student stared somewhere in front of him, and then he turned his gaze to his plump palms. The guy gulped air greedily to catch his breath from a bad dream, which to some extent contained his true desire. In the new picture, the character folded the fist of his right hand and leaned it against his forehead. His face was covered with beads of sweat again, and the student himself gave himself up to his reflections. Based on his thoughts, it all turned out to be true. He was reborn. However, in the next second, he gave a negative answer, thus canceling everything previously said, because it was not about him, but about Cha Mu-yeol, who had a beautiful and slender, pumped-up body. Now his ghost was sitting at the next desk of the main character. The story tells readers how two souls appeared in the air. They flew over the head of the main character and had his face. The first is either confused or scared, because she pursed her lips and strained her thick black eyebrows, and the second, on the contrary, is dissatisfied. The guy describes that they became one. An aura thickened around him, taking on a dark hue as if it was pressing on him, forcing him to make some decision or draw a conclusion. According to his thoughts of Cha Mu-yeol, he remembered that the memory of another soul was an important component. The schoolboy cast a swift and wary glance somewhere in front of him and began to remember something. As it turned out, pictures surfaced in his head that described the actions around his second life. For example, in one of them, the main character dealt a crushing blow to his opponent, forced him to turn his head to the right side, because the push hit his face. On the second, Cha Mu-yeol was jumping rope. On the third, he was looking down at a lying opponent who had just lost to him. Only, as it became known after a short period of time, he did not even remember the original owner of this body. According to the new episodes, the student was lying on the cold floor in the corridor of his school. He was watched by his classmates, who were squatting or standing next to lockers. In other words, according to Cha Mu-yeol, now he had to share his memories with him. He looked at his palms again, causing his face to be covered with beads of sweat again. Even the student's gaze became more focused. After a short period of time, the main character acquainted readers with the following information. Cha Mu-yeol was an MMA athlete. In the new episode, the guy got slapped on the left side of his chubby face. The jolt was so strong that it made him turn away. As it turned out, the actions returned to real life. In it, a schoolboy with black hair in the shape of a pot asked the others aloud if they had seen his punch. He said that if you hit in this way, you can get a concussion. His neighbor, a character in a gray t-shirt, over which was a white school shirt, asked in a surprised tone of voice whether it was true or not. That's just the one. In turn, added that for the best effect it is better to do it using a fist. When the second guy gave a positive answer, he suddenly pointed his index finger at Cha Mu-yeol and exclaimed that he was apparently all right. The main character at this moment was sitting silently at his desk, as if he had frozen. The character probably didn't know how to react properly. A schoolboy with brown hair and a white shirt laughed and said that his non-reacting classmate was still supposedly coming to his senses, even though he had just been hit. The character in the blue coffee scratched his head in a gesture that he was thinking about something. And he will continue to talk, making the audacious assumption that Cha Mu-yeol was really cool. At this very moment, the main character touched the cheek of the same name with his left hand and looked at them. Suddenly, after a long silence, a guy with a black pot on his head finally entered the dialogue. He strained his broad eyebrows and glanced at his neighbor, at the same time telling him that the schoolboy was embarrassing him. He then directed his eyes full of anger at the protagonist he had just scolded and asked him a question. As it turned out, he was wondering why Cha Mu-yeol was staring at him with his mouth open. And after a short period of time, he wondered if he really wanted something worse to be done to him. Which, in fact, they did in the next second. The guy threw away the desk where the main character was sitting, which caused him to pull away and fall to the floor. The push was so strong that the student even slipped slightly. Suddenly, his friend appeared behind the bully, who asked him a question, simultaneously pulling a satisfied smile from ear to ear. As it turned out, based on the remark of the first, Cha Mu-yeol's face exasperated him. That's all. That was the reason for his ill-mannered behavior. However, in his opinion, everything was fine with the main character. At this moment, the character was mentally trying to verify the truthfulness of what had just happened to him. He was sitting with both hands on the cold floor, supporting his back in this way. There was a certain bewilderment on his frightened face. That's just such a detached and incomprehensible reaction angered a schoolboy in a blue jacket. Readers saw how he strained his eyebrows and wrinkled his nose, saying out loud that Cha Mu-yeol continued to look at him as if he had lost his mind. This was the reason for his next act. The guy again treated his classmate badly. That's just the main character was thinking that it wasn't painful at all. In the new episode, he was lying with his arms and legs spread out in different directions, which made his figure look like a star shape. In his opinion, it was impossible. A guy with brown hair and a white school shirt burst out laughing. He said out loud that he felt sorry for Cha Mu-yeol because in his place he would have just faked a faint. But he said it with a satisfied grin, which even made his fox eyes shine. His interlocutor told him that the character was constantly making noise, but now they had to go to the dining room. The two guys began to gradually move away, and now, when their silhouettes were already at the front door, the main character called out to them, thus forcing them to turn around. The faces of both characters froze with bewilderment. As it turned out, Cha Mu-yeol took a fighting stance, which was also done by his second personality, whose spirit was standing behind him. The guy addressed his abusers aloud, letting them know that they could hit him again. He closed his eyebrows and heated his gaze, as if he really meant it. He was being watched by everyone else in the classroom. For a certain period of time, the students froze either from amazement or from a funny situation. Suddenly, the character in the blue jacket asked if he had imagined it, to which the second picked up his mysterious mood and also asked if he had dreamed it all. The schoolboy with a black pot on his head took a couple of steps in the direction of his classmate, who had just been inspired, and asked him a question, according to which, what the overweight guy wanted to get or prove. And he, in turn, made a bold assumption and said it out loud, pulled a satisfied smile. He wondered if his interlocutor was afraid. That's just the character just laughed and retold his question. However, after a short period of time, he made a swinging motion with his left hand and shouted at the top of his voice that he would destroy him today. Hatred and malice were reflected on his face because of his closed eyebrows and bared teeth. When his fist approached the main character, something suddenly surprised him, or rather even alerted him, because his pupils and the iris of his eyes had shrunk to an unthinkable size. As it became known, he struck him on the right cheek, but Cha Mu-yeol did not react to it in any way. The main character was completely calm. Moreover, even his fair skin did not turn red. What cannot be said about a guy with a black pot on his head, because he was covered with small droplets of cold sweat. The overweight student began to burst out laughing at the hilarious situation. A thought rang in his head, according to which they had another chance. The next moment, the guy in the blue jacket asked him a question, wondering what was the reason for his strange reaction. That is, laughter. And the character at that moment was thinking that people who had previously made fun of this body would be punished. How suddenly readers could notice how Cha Mu-yeol swung, which caused his opponent's face to express some degree of fear. He managed to deliver a crushing blow, because a schoolboy with a black pot on his head did not have time to react and dodge, so he literally flew backwards. Now the guy has a chance to take revenge. The story described how all the classmates froze in amazement. Each of them opened his mouth as if they did not expect such a maneuver from the main character, who was overweight. At that moment, the push and pressure provoked the appearance of a stream of air, which, apparently, to some extent helped Cha Mu-yeol to fly away in the opposite direction from his opponent. Moreover, the story described his red-skinned face, which stopped in front of the legs of another schoolboy. Unexpectedly for the readers and the main character, there was a sound, after which Cha Mu-yeol opened his black eyes wide. As it became known after a short period of time, a window appeared in front of the student, in which his personal characteristics appeared. For example, height of 175 centimeters, weight of 173.5 kilograms, 18 years of age. Even the city he lived in and his fighting style, On the right side there were various types of strikes and counterattack abilities. The guy indulged in his thoughts. According to them, in his previous life he was very weak. He had a weak jaw, but now he had a chance to turn all his memories into reality. He imagined how to strike his opponent again in the fighting ring. And then, in reality, attention is transferred to a schoolboy with brown hair and a white shirt, who looked down at his friend with horror. The next moment, his face was covered with cold sweat, because he cursed out loud and made the assumption that it was all like a dream. The student cast his gaze at the main character, who at that moment was thinking about the status window after waking up, which made him wonder if it was true or not. There was also a look of amazement and surprise on his face. The mission window he saw at the beginning brought him back to his rival. Cha Mu-yeol pulled a smile from ear to ear and strained his fist, laughing suddenly. A frightened schoolboy looked at him, according to whom the main character looked very scary. He even bared his teeth and strained his eyebrows, which greatly emphasized his small wrinkles around his eyes. The overweight guy was taking steps in the direction of his opponent, who literally froze, when suddenly he decided to speak, trying to seem brave. The schoolboy, in a demanding tone of voice, made it clear to his approaching classmate that he did not even dare to touch him. Moreover, he should stay away from him. Suddenly, Cha Mu-yeol, whose face expressed disgust, entered the dialogue. He asked a question to a guy with brown hair, according to which the main character wanted to know if his classmate liked to eat solid food. However, there was a stunned reaction in Togo, because he narrowed one eye and asked the question again. And the main character, slightly tilting his head, explained that in the future it would be difficult for a character in a white shirt to chew. Moreover, there was a high probability that he would even lose a few teeth. However, he, in turn, viciously swore and tried to stop the threat from the speaker. Suddenly, the story informed readers that a combat mission had begun, according to which the main character had to fight with hooligans. The guy grabbed his classmate with brown hair and pulled his collar, rejected him, looked at him questioningly. After a short period of time, the picture showed the audience that the mysterious task was for Cha Mu-yeol to collect 30 teeth from a school bandit, for which he would receive a reward of 20 points. The main character spoke out loud, telling his opponent that he would not stop. As it turned out, the combat mission was already completed on 2/30. Therefore, he swung and shouted at the top of his voice that it was time to take the third one first. From his strong blow, the schoolboy even got blood. However, he made a firm decision to become a champion. The story continues its rapid development. This time the story is about two fighters who are fighting in the ring. It was Makhmudov and the main character. The first of them struck Cha Mu-yeol, causing his nose to bleed. The opponent forced the guy to step back a little, because the push hit his face hard. The referee shouted at the top of his voice, thus attracting the attention of the audience. In his opinion, it was a perfect ending and a very dangerous fight, but amazing at the same time. Everyone was rooting for Makhmudov's fatal elbow strike. The judge in the ring raised both hands, crossing them, which meant the end of the fight. At this moment, the winner approached the viewer and stood in a pose that symbolized his strength and power over the main character. The confrontation was over. That's just, as it became known based on the thoughts of Cha Mu-yeol, from the beginning of the fight, the match had to fail. The reason was that in Makhmudov, who at that time was rejoicing at the victory, spreading his arms in different directions. The muscles were in shape thanks to steroids. It was all a hoax, but the character still wanted other fighters to be in his place, because he himself felt like a scapegoat. At that moment, the guy was lying under Yves. He was dressed in a hospital uniform, covered with a white blanket. Suddenly he opened his eyes and began to observe what was around him, when suddenly someone touched his forehead with his hand, which greatly frightened Cha Mu-yeol, so much so that his eyes widened to an unprecedented size. The stranger called him by name and asked him a question, according to which he wanted to know what it was. After a short period of time, the story introduced readers to a new character. He was a man with gray hair and stubble. He pulled a satisfied grin and looked at the lying guy. As it turned out, he hoped that Cha Mu-yeol would do what he wanted. But the guy didn't listen to him. Although, as the stranger put it, he didn't care. In the next episode, viewers found out why he was so happy. The reason was simple and obvious. It consisted in the fact that thanks to the main character, the image of a man became clean again. Moreover, the character even thanked him. He leaned slightly towards Cha Mu-yeol to show him his phone, which had some kind of video on the screen. As it became known to readers, it was about the conference of CEO Jang Yong-gil. It was the same character who visited the main character. He was dressed in a strict black suit and was holding some paper in his hands. The character said out loud that everyone's hope, that is, Cha Mu-yeol, may have been the first Korean to become a WFC champion. That's just Jang Yong-gil was forced to reluctantly inform the audience that the fighter had left MMA. From this phrase, the main character's eyes seemed to come out of their orbits, because even the iris was not visible in them, only the protein. The man continued to talk on the video about what he thought about the correctness of this choice. Moreover, he bowed his gray-haired head and made a promise that Jang Yong-gil would take care of Cha Mu-yeol for the rest of his life. From this, the main character became even more drooping. As it turned out, the man made a bold assumption, although it might seem that he was sure that the people from above had made a firm decision to get rid of the guy. From this remark, a smug smile appeared on his face from ear to ear, when suddenly someone interrupted his monologue by entering the door. When Jang Yong-gil turned his head over his left shoulder, he saw several men in uniform. He tensed his eyebrows, which made his facial expressions seem ominous, and was surprised at how quickly they came. Then he pointed with his left hand at the main character, who was watching motionlessly and could not even turn his head, let alone answer, and exclaimed that it was their elder who did not want to listen to him. There was a smile on his face that reflected madness and craziness to some extent. In his opinion, Cha Mu-yeol's condition should have been the reason that would provoke them to listen to him more carefully. Moreover, none of them wanted anyone to hit him on the head, and even from the back. At this moment, the men lined up in a row and gave a positive response in chorus. When Jang Yong-gil and the rest of the fighters walked out the door, the gray-haired character turned to the main character and instructed him to be a good boy and be healthy, even if he could no longer fight. The man supplemented his monologue with a phrase according to which Cha Mu-yeol was no longer supposed to teach his juniors. Readers could see how disgust was reflected in his gaze. He left the character alone in a dark room. The guy gave himself up to his thoughts, according to which, due to a severe injury leading to paralysis, only his eyes, which were streaming with tears, could move. In his opinion, he was alive, but as dead. The picture began to lead the narrative around Cha Mu-yeol with excess weight. He was at school, sitting at his desk with both hands folded on it. Apparently, the guy was thinking about something, not like his neighbor who lay down and probably slept. As it turned out, the main character indulged in his thoughts. He wondered if it was an illusion after death and coming back to life. The character made a demonstrative exhalation, as if this situation weighed on him. But when he pointed out to the audience the blue window with his personal characteristics, Cha Mu-yeol noticed to himself that it looked quite realistic. Suddenly, 5 plates with different fighting values appeared in front of his eyes: resistance, deflection, pain, knee strike, boxing. Based on his reflections, the character fought really badly before he died. Moreover, in his previous life, he didn't even have time to train. Readers may have noticed how his large black eyes reflected a window of resilience. That's just, in his opinion, boxing could still be learned. And when he realized that he wanted to learn another skill, his body was not sufficiently trained. At this point, the guy's nostrils narrowed and the corners of his lips dropped down. However, this time it was different. One of the reasons was the fact that in addition to all these techniques, SSS durability appeared. The story told how the main character carefully studied the status window. In his mind, he thought that thanks to him and his body, Cha Mu-yeol would be able to return to his dream once again. The guy indulged in memories, according to which he was lifted on his shoulder by either comrades or coaches, and he himself held the winning prize, a belt. Around him, everyone was happy about his victory, so they gesticulated and whistled vividly. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted. Someone opened the door to the office and deliberately slammed it hard. A figure of a tall character appeared in the classroom, wearing a black t-shirt, over which was a white shirt with long sleeves. He had brown hair cut in the shape of a pot, which slightly did not reach his thick black eyebrows. His potato nose attracted all the attention of readers. An angry schoolboy crossed the threshold and put his right hand in the pocket of his black pants, shouting angrily about something. Apparently, he was looking for someone. Cha Mu-yeol turned his head towards him with a completely relaxed expression when he appeared and thought that maybe he should have started with this character. When the enraged guy was right in front of the main character's face, he asked with some indignation if he was the one who touched his friend. The schoolboy put both hands in his pockets, strained his eyebrows, which made his gaze seem very heavy. That's just Cha Mu-yeol gave himself up to his thoughts, according to which, after defeating Young Young-woo and Hong Kwang-woo, rumors quickly spread. His reaction was somewhat inhibited. He parted his plump lips and looked questioningly at the speaker. And after a short period of time, the main character gave a positive answer, but he said it without a shadow of fear. Mentally, Cha Mu-yeol expressed his gratitude to these guys, when suddenly he struck a couple of blows to an angry schoolboy, while he was completely not expecting it. The guy exclaimed that it was a Dempsey roll. It was as if he was playing with his opponent, not giving him a chance and time to defend. Only readers noticed how this schoolboy with a brown pot on his head shouted at the top of his voice to spare him, turned around and ran to the exit. The narration focused on his right hand, which picked up some white object with a red tint. The main character squatted down and began to examine the novelty, at the same time thinking that, in his opinion, everything should have ended if he got them as soon as possible. But that continued to last. The guy made a bold assumption that the children could not control their emotions. That's just when he expressed his gratitude to them for their teeth, but suddenly he was interrupted from his thoughts again. Cha Mu-yeol heard someone swear, so he made a surprised expression and looked in the direction where the noise was coming from. As it turned out, it was a girl with medium-length brown hair. Her bangs covered her eyebrows, which made it difficult to see the full expression of her facial expressions. However, according to her remark, the main character was very good at fighting. The schoolgirl put her right hand on her side and held the phone with her left. Suddenly, the story changed the narrative. This time she was describing a street space. Apparently, it was already evening, because the last rays of the sun illuminated a tall building surrounded by a stone fence. In the next episode, readers' attention was focused on a dark room full of junk. Inside it was a group of schoolchildren. One of the guys called the name of the main character, insulting him in a new remark. As it turned out, a schoolboy in a blue jacket and with a black pot on his head was having a dialogue with him. He indignantly made it clear that it was true. His thick eyebrows closed, making his gaze look like a predatory one. The guy wondered when Cha Mu-yeol had time to learn boxing and give him and his friend a couple of crushing blows. On the other side of the conversation was a student with a brown t-shirt, over which was a white shirt. This character had dark hair pulled back. He dabbled in illegal substances and angrily pulled a smug grin when his friend started talking about boxing. Then the guy laughed it all. After a short period of time, it became clear to readers what the reason was. The stranger felt that the main character should have gone through a few more training sessions. When he put his hands in his pockets and was silent for a while, the character in the blue jacket addressed him as Ju-sing. His eyes, which had shrunk to an unimaginable size, reflected fear. Small drops of cold sweat even flowed down his face, and he, in turn, bared his snow-white teeth and strained his eyebrows, thus emphasizing the wrinkles around his black eyes. He asked the question, according to which the others had any problems. However, the guys spread their hands in different directions and gave a negative response in chorus, at the same time asking Ju-sing to calm down his ardor and temper, referring to the fact that Chong-woo still did not know. And also there were still a lot of those who knew that the guy was really good at judo. And the student himself said that even though Cha Mu-yeol had learned one or two techniques, regardless of his skills, if the student caught him, the main character would have to pay. In the next episode, the story described his dark eyes, which had shrunk to such a size that the guy could be compared to a madman. He pulled a smile from ear to ear and said that it was time to get down to business, to teach the arrogant guy a lesson. Who, by the way, at that moment arched his left eyebrow and lowered the tips of his lips, which made his expression express a certain detachment, although more disgust. In front of him was a heroine with dark hair who kept telling him that he was very unusual. Moreover, she was interested in the question, according to which where the guy learned to fight like that. However, apparently, the student was dissatisfied with such attention towards him, so he made it clear to her that he himself did not know who she was. Cha Mu-yeol asked her to stop following him. The reason was that they were in the men's room. But the stranger didn't care at all, because she even asked the question what was the matter. The student told her interlocutor that wherever he went, she would still find information about him. This phrase made the main character come to the conclusion that this girl was out of her mind. The next moment, the heroine said that it was the perfect time to deal with bullies. Why did the guy ask what she was talking about? And after a short period of time, he asked her to forget about all this. But the stranger continued to stand her ground. She crossed both arms and added, making an offer to her classmate to catch all the guys with a bad reputation. However, according to Cha Mu-yeol, he was not interested in this in any way. The main character asked what her name was. In the next episode, the story showed readers that the main character was only thinking about fighting. He mentally appealed to Jang Yong-gil with a request to return to MMA. His cheeky face showed diligence and firmness. As it became known, for a rematch, he first had to get into the RFC, a professional league for young and promising fighters. Then the guy gave himself up to thoughts. In his previous life, he had already received a gold medal once. He was only interested in the question of whether he should have started boxing again. When the guys crossed the threshold, the girl exclaimed at the top of her voice that her interlocutor had not responded to her claims. The next moment, someone pushed Cha Mu-yeol with his shoulder. The guy turned his head and looked up slightly, because the stranger was taller than him. It was Ju-sing. The guy was looking down at him, pulling a smug grin, which could make readers disgusted at the sight of him. Suddenly, the schoolboy delivered a crushing blow to the main character using his left leg. The push was so strong that the guy with the extra weight flew off several meters, sliding all the while on the floor. A girl with dark hair stood up for him. However, Ju-sing didn't even pay attention to her because he just gave the order to take her away, which, in fact, happened in the following seconds. The bully looked at his comrades, who stood in an attacking pose, and asked them what they were doing. The schoolboy also said, adding that it was better for these guys to get out of there before he immobilized them too. One of them gave a positive answer, referring to the fact that he was about to leave. Ju-sing then called out to the big-built guy, telling him to hold the girl very tightly. Readers could notice how the heroine was holding the phone at that moment as if she was filming everything that was happening. In the next episode, the story focuses readers' attention on Cha Mu-yul, who slightly stood up, leaning on both hands behind his back. It was difficult for him because of the excess weight. His face was full of rage. The student gave only one name, Beak Ju-song. At that moment, the guy took a couple of steps in his direction and made it clear that they were not friends. Moreover, he was told that the main character was looking for him. When the schoolboy found himself in front of Cha Mu-yul, who was already standing on both legs, he asked him, wondering what he wanted from him, making the audacious assumption that he wanted to arrange a fight. The bully laughed without much shyness, and at this moment, the main character's face became more serious, apparently due to the fact that his interlocutor decided that he wanted to crush him. In the next episode, Beak Ju-song took out his phone and asked him a question out loud. He wondered if the guy had forgotten about one video. As it became known after a short period of time, Cha Mu-yul was on it, who was jumping and clapping his hands at the same time. From this, the schoolboy's eyes narrowed to an incredible size. That's just the bully continued to put pressure on him morally, saying that it wasn't all, because it was just the last video shot. The faces of his friends became smug, and the expression of the girl's facial expressions, on the contrary, surprised. The next moment, the story focused readers' attention on a new remark by Beak Ju-song, who said out loud that they would shoot another video today. The character stuck out his tongue as if he was teasing the guy. Except Cha Mu-yul wasn't going to stand for it. He hit the hand of his interlocutor, in which there was a phone, which caused him to drop it. The bully swore out loud and bared his snow-white teeth, but at the moment his eyes became more surprised. As it turned out, the reason was that the main character was going to deal him a crushing blow, which made everyone present surprised. The story described how Beak Ju-song's right cheek turned red from the flowing blood. He was swallowing hard, thus restoring his breath, which had been lost from surprise. Mentally, the bully did not understand how he could allow such a thing. He glared fiercely at his opponent, who clenched his fist at that moment. The main character uttered a remark aloud, according to which he momentarily forgot who was his real target for revenge. His figure was looking down at his opponent. The sunlight fell on his back, thus darkening his face and the front part of his torso, making his silhouette seem cruel. But the bully was still wondering. He couldn't figure out who Cha Mu-yul really was. The story continues its rapid development. This narration begins with a description of the fight between the main character and Beak Ju-song. While the second one was trying to somehow neutralize his opponent, Cha Mu-yul dodged, making various groupings or attacks. They moved at such a fast speed that a small stream of air appeared in the room, which lifted dust from the dirty floor. Such a reaction on the part of the student greatly unnerved the bully. He even mentally cursed and cursed him. When the main character stopped, he lowered his left hand and clenched the other into a fist and pressed it to his side. And readers might have noticed how his legs, folded together, froze in the air, as if he was about to give out some intricate trick. At this moment, Beak Ju-song, with a red cheek, greedily swallowed puffs of warm air to restore heavy breathing. Large drops of sweat began to flow down his face, which apparently meant that the guy got up to fight hand to hand. The bully strained his thick brown eyebrows, which made his black eyes look heavy. And mentally, the schoolboy reflected on the fact that only a few days had passed, and something had definitely happened to Cha Mu-yul. The story describes how both characters took a defensive pose. They bent their knees slightly, lowered their pelvis, and gave their body weight a little forward, and also put their hands in front of them in time to either grab the opponent or neutralize him. All you had to do was strike and keep your distance. Suddenly, the attack was launched by Beak Ju-song, who rushed towards his opponent, cursing at him at the same time. The plan was to grab him by the collar and get it over with. That's just the school bandit failed to crush his opponent, because the main character struck him first, and even right in the jaw. The push and pressure were so lightning fast that the bully flew away from him, closing his eyes and opening his mouth in a quiet scream. The other guys didn't understand anything. Moreover, they did not understand how to react correctly, because one of them, a schoolboy with a brown pot on his head, strained his thick eyebrows, which caused his facial expressions to express anger and hatred. And the second, a large-built schoolboy with a short haircut, opened his mouth in amazement and eyes wide. The second asked the first if they should help their friend, but he, in turn, gave a negative answer, referring to the fact that Ju-song told them not to interfere, because he wanted to do everything himself. Moreover, the guy Houston was also engaged in judo. However, after this remark, he was no longer sure that the bully had succeeded. Readers saw a drop of doubt in his face, which was covered with cold sweat. Suddenly, the story began to describe a picture in which Beak Ju-song grabbed the main character by the collar and shouted at the top of his voice with joy that he had caught him. But his cheerful and enthusiastic mood did not last long, because it instantly changed to a repulsively surprised one. The guy opened his mouth and said nothing. His cheek was swollen and his mouth was bleeding. As it turned out, the student's reaction was a little slow, because he had just realized that he had managed to catch his opponent. Therefore, a smug smile appeared on his face, which rose only at one corner. The school bandit shouted at the top of his voice that it was time to end everything. Only something interrupted him and made him watch nervously. After a short period of time, readers became aware that the main character made a lunge on his left leg and struck a crushing blow with his right hand. Now the bully's blood was pouring not only from his mouth, but also from his nose. Apparently, he temporarily lost consciousness from a strong push, because the audience could note to themselves how he rolled his eyes up, and then they were allowed to see his tooth, which seemed to float in the air. Cha Mu-yeol's blows caught Beak Ju-song by surprise, because he did not even have time to react to new ones, inaccurately fend them off. And now another fist was flying at him, which provoked the appearance of another tooth in space. The bully seemed to have lost the pupils and irises of his eyes, replaced by only the white, which gave his look a somewhat insane appearance. And the school bandit himself seemed to be flying in the air under the pressure of the character's blows. Once again, the guy mentally cursed. The reason was simple and obvious. Everything did not go according to his plan. In the next episode, the story describes a picture in which two guys from his group and a girl who was on the side of Cha Mu-yeol were standing. One of the faces reflected incomprehension and even surprise. Apparently, they were waiting for the end and wanted to see how the situation would turn out, and in whose favor. The main character struck at Beak Ju-song again, causing him to literally fly back. And when he landed on the cold stone floor, he involuntarily turned his head to the right side. His eyes were completely white, as if he was a ghost. Readers could have noticed how his second cheek became swollen. Cha Mu-yeol stood with his legs wide apart and looked down at him, while the girl with dark hair was filming everything on her phone. Suddenly the main character spoke, who was finally happy about something, which made the three open their mouths in surprise and watch something expectantly. As it turned out, the thing was that an overweight student jumped up, raising both hands up and shouted with delight that he had managed to accumulate 30 teeth. And so the combat mission was over. He continued to admire, which only caused others to be in a sense of anxiety. The story continued its rapid development. In the new episode, she describes the bright lights from the glowing windows, because it was already dark outside. This time, a dark blue window popped up in front of the main character, according to which the guy managed to collect 30 teeth from school bullies, for which he had already received 20 points. And Cha Mu-yeol himself sat on the futon and beat his sides, at the same time rejoicing and shouting at the top of his voice about it. The character pulled on a smug smile, slightly baring his snow-white teeth, and began to think about what he could do with his reward in the form of 20 points. Suddenly, cards with different techniques appeared in front of him. These were counterattack skills, fortitude, boxing, wrestling, jiu-jitsu, kicking. The guy was surprised by the third and fourth abilities, because they belonged to Class BF. In the next episode, the main character crossed both arms on his chest and carefully examined the novelties, simultaneously thinking about something important. As it became known after a short period of time, the most difficult thing in his life before was the struggle. Cha Mu-yeol remembered how he knocked over his opponents, and they him. Wrestling helped him a lot, but if a person didn't know jiu-jitsu, then he had no choice but to lose. After this thought, a drop of sweat ran down his fair skin, his eyebrows frowned, and his eyes narrowed. That's just his gaze became more attentive, as if he was a predator who was hunting for his prey. Readers became aware of the reason why the main character began to behave like this. It was that in order for him to become one of the MMA fighters in the future, he should have studied jiu-jitsu. That's why Cha Mu-yeol pulled his index finger and chose the function of the same name. This provoked the appearance of a bright blue color, a variety of similar cards with other movements, which glowed with a bright light poured into space. It even made the main character spread his arms in different directions in surprise. He opened his mouth and watched the situation in surprise, when suddenly everything stopped. The character was sitting on the case and leaned on both hands, slightly leaning back. Readers may have noticed how he gulped air greedily to recover his breath from the overwhelming emotions. Cha Mu-yeol looked at his palms and rarely pulled a satisfied smile from ear to ear, baring his even and snow-white teeth. Mentally, he thought that it was amazing. The reason was that all the techniques immediately came to his mind. And now he's a jiu-jitsu master. The main character stood on both legs and strained his right arm, clenching his fist at the same time. This pose meant victory, because all the information immediately entered his head. Moreover, he will need a lot of time if he continues to study at school. Cha Mu-yeol looked down. Readers could follow how he looked at his stomach. According to the character's thoughts, all he had to do was take care of his body. In the next episode, the guy was already running down the funny street, dressed in a black sports uniform. However, the story decided to switch the audience's attention to a group of schoolchildren who were sitting in a dark room and having a conversation. One of them asked a question. He was interested in who the main character was, because he wasn't that good from the very beginning. That's just such a reaction provoked his interlocutor with a brown pot on his head. This character, with both hands in his pockets, cursed at him and wondered if he was specifically testing the limits of his anger. However, a schoolboy with a large build and short haircut exclaimed, spitting, how Cha Mu-yeol managed to change in such a short time. The beaten Beak Ju-song, in a demanding tone of voice, gave the order for everyone to be silent, because it was their fault why he looked like worse. There was a large patch on each swollen cheek of the guy, and his left eye was almost not visible at all. A friend approached him and asked what he thought about it. He asked him a question, according to which is Beak Ju-song going to stay in the same state? After all, shouldn't they at least have taught a lesson to a cheeky classmate? But his monologue was interrupted by another character, a guy with brown hair and a potato nose. In his opinion, the former would not have been able to handle it on his own, citing the fact that hadn't he seen Cha Mu-yeol fight. After this remark, everyone in the dark room fell silent, indulging in their thoughts. According to the thoughts of one of them, it was a complete disgrace, when suddenly someone interrupted the unfortunate silence. He diluted the situation by saying a remark based on which, if Ju-song allows him to take revenge, he will do everything in his power. This made the school bully react questioningly, who cast his gaze in the direction of the noise. Readers got acquainted with a new character. He was a guy with wavy dark hair and small eyes set wide apart. He had thick bushy eyebrows that grew towards the end. The mysterious hero asked where Cha Mu-yeol was now, whom he had just scolded out loud. They decided to hold a vote. At this very moment, the main character was engaged. He was wearing a black sports uniform and was honing his punches while fighting with someone invisible. Readers could note for themselves how he greedily gulped air to restore heavy breathing. However, the guy still continued to improve his skills by boxing in space, when suddenly someone interrupted his studies, called Cha Mu-yeol by name. The character stopped and turned his head over his right shoulder, casting a surprised glance in the direction from which the noise was heard. As it turned out, it was his new friend who asked him if he always did that. She was wearing a white tank top and blue denim shorts. The girl crossed both arms over her chest and walked towards her classmate. The main character asked her what exactly she was talking about. After a short period of time, the schoolgirl answered him, focusing on breathing through her mouth, because she did not understand how it helped, so from her lips one could hear the assumption that it somehow accelerated the process. However, Cha Mu-yeol said it was just a habit. In the next episode, viewers saw her radiant smile, which was accompanied by a remark, according to which another time the girl invited a classmate to come to her new channel and help her with the video, and added on her own that, in her opinion, the habit of breathing with her mouth was very unusual and strange. The story described how the main character's face was covered with large streams of sweat from doing push-ups. The guy said out loud that he wasn't interested, but the stranger still didn't understand him. She sat down and crossed her legs, explaining that 700,000 YouTube subscribers had invited him. For this simple and obvious reason, he should have been grateful. Moreover, she was interested in why this character trained so hard, so one thought arose in her head, based on which he wanted to become a real fighter. The last words took the character by surprise to some extent, because he stopped doing push-ups, leaning on both hands and his right leg, turned his head over his right shoulder, and looked at the interlocutor. The girl, by the way, was unapproachable. It might seem so to readers, because she said that there was a lot of news on YouTube right now. The heroine made a bold assumption that he did not fight this, so surprise appeared on her face. And in the next episode, she asked for his attention and showed him something on her smartphone. As it became clear after a short period of time, the schoolgirl presented a general training program for fighters. The winner could receive 200 million won and will have the right to work out in the gym. When the guy looked at her, his eyebrows and lips relaxed with interest. The girl explained that all beginners in martial arts are very happy to join her. Moreover, she was firmly convinced that he knew about it because he had trained so hard. Cha Mu-yeol took a cursory glance at his black eyes, which after a short period of time became huge from stupefaction. Suddenly, a crazy thought came to the head of the main character. He decided to take revenge on Jang Yong-gil because now it is possible. In the next episode, readers could see the message that came to the heroine's phone. The guy with a dark hair color wrote to her. However, it would be difficult for readers to identify his facial features because the photo was Maltese in size, but the content could only be read. According to him, the stranger asked the interlocutor a question in order to find out if some student was studying with her in the same educational institution. As it became known based on the words of the heroine herself, this character often wrote to her. They stared at the phone questioningly, when suddenly the schoolgirl turned to Cha Mu-yeol and said that he should be grateful for talking to her, to which he simply gave a positive answer without a shadow of interest. The main character wondered if that user was a famous person, when suddenly his friend, for some unknown reason, uttered the word no. That is why the student turned his head over his right shoulder and began to watch the speaker questioningly. However, there was some kind of horror or regret on her face. The girl arched her eyebrows and looked at Cha Mu-yeol, asking him what it was. As it turned out, when he was fighting with Beak Ju-song, someone was filming them. The heroine showed him a video in which the guys stood opposite each other and used their fists. The file was signed as Chaos Reigns in the School. In addition, the situation was similar to the fact that this video was edited, and it showed that the main character was just trying to neutralize his opponent. The story informed readers about the occurrence of angry comments. This made the student even more furious. He arched his left eyebrow and bared his teeth, looking at the smartphone screen that his friend was holding. She asked what they should do now. The narration described how the main character mentally cursed Beak Ju-song, who not only attacked him, but also framed him. Suddenly, something caught Cha Mu-yeol's attention. The stunned one called Yun Min by name. Now readers have finally found out what her name is. The girl turned her head towards the speaker who asked her to help. Silence hung between the guys for a while. Apparently, the heroine did not expect that her classmate would ask her for anything at all. Therefore, her reaction was somewhat inhibited, because she just asked as if she hadn't heard. In the next episode, the story describes to the audience how something started. And at that moment, a dark background appeared before their eyes, which was diluted by a brown chair, a blue keyboard and a mouse. After a short period of time, it became known that it was a real-time chat, which was already watched by 28 people. According to the comments, users have been waiting for his appearance for a long time. Moreover, they would like to see who still led the live broadcast. One of them asked the blogger to show his cute face. And unexpectedly for the readers and viewers of the hour, Cha Mu-yeol appeared on a black background. For this simple and obvious reason, the comments seemed to explode, because in the opinion of subscribers it was a kind of fraud. Because they knew that the chat belonged to Yun Min. Sitting in a pink room in front of a lamp and a computer, the main character lowered his head, as if he was guilty, and introduced himself. After that, several characters made the audacious assumption that they had already seen him, which is why they made the unanimous decision that Cha Mu-yeol had done something to the girl. However, the student was unshakable. He continued his monologue. The reason he borrowed Mina's channel was to discuss that viral video. Users asked him to sing a song or call from his brother, but others wrote that he pretended to be a victim. The main character gave a positive answer, which meant that he was the person who crushed Beak Ju-song. In the next episode, the guy lifted the left corner of his lips, causing a cheeky expression to freeze on his face. He said aloud, addressing his abuser, that he would soon deal with him once and for all. As it turned out, Beak Ju-song himself and his company were watching this broadcast, and the students heard how Cha Mu-yeol threatened them that he would make them pay for everything. The story continues its rapid development. This time, the narrative describes to readers how Cha Mu-yeol gave a positive answer, which meant that it was he who crushed the ill-mannered Beak Ju-song. The guy pulled an ill-fated smile, baring his snow-white teeth. Moreover, he will get rid of him as soon as possible and make him suffer punishment. The student himself with a swollen right cheek was covered with large drops of sweat. Apparently, he was nervous because his opponent's words made the guy's saggy soul swear. His friends, who rode over his battered figure, picked up his mood and tried to make sure whether Cha Mu-yeol had gone crazy. His second acquaintance asked, squatting down, what they needed to do now, because according to him, the main character would definitely come for him. However, Beak Ju-song decided to appear brave. He stood up on both feet and straightened up, simultaneously shouting at the top of his voice that there was no need to be afraid. The reason was simple and obvious. The public was on their side, so the main character couldn't do anything if they didn't resist. That's just in the next episode, someone interrupted from the conversation. Someone came into the room, who repeated his last remark, based on which the students will be interested to see what he will do. The three characters turned their heads in the direction from where the noise came from. Surprise was reflected on their faces. After a short period of time, the story showed the readers Yoon-min and Cha Mu-yeol. The guy leaned his left hand on the glass handrail and watched his classmates with a calm expression of facial expressions. But the girl giggled viciously. She pulled a winning smile in a gesture that they literally just caught someone red-handed. In her right hand, the heroine held a black tripod with a phone and filmed the reaction of the trio. When Beak Ju-song looked at Cha Mu-yeol and Yoon-min with a swollen right cheek, readers could notice how drops of cold sweat flowed down his face. Moreover, his black eyes seemed to have been swallowed up by the white space, because from alertness and dazed, the iris and pupils seemed to have disappeared. He opened his mouth and watched his classmates. In the next episode, the main character finally entered into a dialogue. He strained his thick black eyebrows and pulled a victorious smile, at the same time saying that, of course, Cha Mu-yeol should have beaten Beak Ju-song until he resisted. As it turned out, the guys were standing in the same place where they shot the video when the main character was doing physical exercises. The bright rays of the sun illuminated the space filled with various pipes and tanks. Suddenly, an overweight schoolboy with distraught eyes said out loud that he should let his opponent draw a conclusion. According to the first, the guy asked a question based on which Beak Ju-song would like to be neutralized, and then he would start resisting. But the second option was that a self-confident schoolboy could be defeated during a fight. Then came the comments that called Cha Mu-yeol a gangster. At this moment, the main character turned to the audience and made it clear to them that they could really claim it. Moreover, he even gave their address. As it became known after a short period of time, the guys were in the back park of the Jungmok school. New messages from viewers said that at the moment this is the real-time video that was most often searched for. Cha Mu-yeol stood in the left corner to open a view of the rest of the hooligans. Beak Ju-song cast a furious glance at his opponent and mentally cursed at him, while simultaneously indulging in reflections according to which he was interested in what he needed to do. The guy was curious whether he just had to run away or not. Suddenly, someone addressed the character by name, causing his black eyes to shrink to an unthinkable size. Moreover, drops of sweat began to flow on his fair skin. As it turned out, it was the main character. He turned in the direction of his abuser and with a smile on his face said that he should not have run away. The reason was simple and obvious. Cha Mu-yeol made a promise to catch up with him if he did run, and then crush him. All this time, Yoon-mina was holding a tripod with a phone and taking pictures. Moreover, the student scolded him, saying that Beak Ju-song could go and complain to his mother. From this remark, the guy strained his eyebrows, bulged his eyes, which greatly emphasized his wrinkles in the upper part of his face, and bared his snow-white teeth, which caused readers to trace the appearance of swollen veins on his jaw. However, the main character did not stop there. He asked his rival if he really grew up in a dysfunctional family, because judging by his behavior, this was also possible. Some commentators even admired how witty Cha Mu-yeol was. In the next episode, Beak Ju-song took off his long-sleeve white shirt and gave his classmate a positive response. He started to take steps in his direction, at the same time shouting at the top of his voice that they really needed to fight. But, as it might seem, the main character was only pleased with such a reaction, because he sincerely smiled and said that now it was the same Beak Ju-song that he knew. The guy clapped his hands, holding his boxing gloves with his right hand, and the next time he threw them in the red helmet at the feet of the opponent, which made him stop for a while. Cha Mu-yeol made it clear in a demanding tone of voice that he should take them. Beak Ju-song, in turn, arched one eyebrow at his classmate's demanding tone and opened his mouth without making a sound. He cast an incomprehensible glance at the main character, who asked him a question in retaliation. The guy was wondering what he was doing because he literally just told him to put them on. At this time, Cha Mu-yeol himself was pulling on blue wrestling gloves and perplexedly watching the further actions of his interlocutor. But the school bully didn't want to follow his lead. He got angry, readers could tell by the expression on his face. The guy arched both eyebrows, opening his black eyes wide, which gave his look a wild look, like an angry predator. Beak Ju-song shouted at the top of his voice words that meant he hated the overweight character. He made it clear that he didn't need the red gloves and helmet, so he kicked them away with his left foot. The demonstrative action on the part of the student forced Cha Mu-yeol to ask him a question, according to which he wanted to make sure whether the bully really did not need them. In the next episode, the story described how the main character jumped, and readers could follow and note for themselves how both of his legs seemed to freeze in the air, pushing off from the stone gray floor. That's just the overweight character was only happy with this outcome of events for the simple and obvious reason that, in his opinion, it would be a fair fight. His figure was hidden by the shadow, but this did not prevent you from seeing the evil expression of his gaze on his face, and the blue glove, which was making a swinging movement, preparing to strike his opponent. The story focused on his hand, around which a dark repulsive aura appeared. Apparently, such a sharp activity on the part of Cha Mu-yeol made the school bandit nervous, because his eyes grew to an unthinkable size, and a drop of cold sweat flowed down his left cheek. After a short period of time, the audience could see how the main character dealt a crushing blow to the jaw of his opponent, around which even a bright orange glow appeared. The blue glove made Beak Ju-song turn his head to the right side, although one of his eyes was still open. That's just it didn't matter for the simple and obvious reason that the student didn't have time to react, dodging, or use a counterattack. However, apparently, he was just preparing because his left hand, clenched into a fist, was raised up. Cha Mu-yeol continued his series of punches. The aftershocks and their pressure were so strong that they were literally slamming into the wall of a touchy with a swollen cheek. Readers could even notice how a small stream of air appeared in the space. The comments seemed to explode again. Users called the main character quite agile, despite his problems with excess weight. In the next episode, the character pulled a satisfied grin, because he was sure of his victory. The guy hit his opponent, thus bringing him to the floor, which could even be traced in slow motion. That's just Beak Ju-song didn't fall in one place. He literally rolled across the stone floor, heading towards where his comrades were standing and watching the situation. And those, in turn, spread their arms and looked at the school bully, after which clouds of dust rose, without even trying to stop him. In the next moment, the story focuses readers' attention on Cha Mu-yeol, who straightened his silhouette and impressively watched his abusers. His slightly arched thick eyebrows and slightly parted plump lips against the background of plump cheeks gave him a relaxed look, as if almost all the work had already been done. The guy even breathed steadily, suggesting to the audience that he was not tired in any way. However, according to commentators, it was too much. Moreover, as it became known thanks to several of them, strangers have already reported this. Suddenly, two dark silhouettes appeared on the right side of the main character. One of the men gave an order that everyone stay in their seats. In the next episode, the story allowed readers to take a closer look at them. They were law enforcement officers who wore black trousers with a molding of this color and a blue long-sleeve shirt with a badge on it. The policeman angrily asked the students a question, demanding that they tell them what they were doing. Commentators at this moment turned to strangers and asked them to grab Cha Mu-yeol. Suddenly, Beak Ju-song, who had a red nose, entered the dialogue. He was bleeding from there, and not only. Apparently, his mouth was also injured. The schoolboy pointed his index finger at his opponent and, wrinkling his face, made it clear to the police that he had attacked him. The screams of the school bully were accompanied by a shift in the focus of the story from him to Cha Mu-yeol, who continued to stand and watch him, holding both hands in blue gloves. Young Mina continued to shoot with her phone all this time, holding a black tripod and standing a little to the side. Suddenly, in the next episode, the narrative began to describe the reaction of two policemen. They furrowed their brows and watched the students for a while. Beak Ju-song, with a swollen face, scolded the main character and said that now he was finished. Moreover, now his whole life will be ruined because of such a terrible act. The school bandit's face was frozen with a grin and a smug expression of facial expressions that spoke of his self-confidence. That's just how things turned out differently. Readers may have noticed how one of the policemen squatted down next to Beak Ju-song, who had a question on his face, and only thanks to his bulging eyes and surprise, it became clear that the situation had turned far from in his favor. He even opened his mouth. The guy was looking down somewhere, and in the next episode, the reason became clear. It consisted of handcuffs that were fixed on his hands. Mentally, the bully tried to understand why everything happened like that. After a short period of time, it became known that Beak Ju-song was arrested on charges of making fun of a minor. A policeman with an angry expression on his face said that he had the right to remain silent. That's just the guy, in turn, freaked out. He pointed at Cha Mu-yeol and asked why they were arresting him, because they had to do it with the main character. In the next episode, readers could notice how some kind of countdown was going, reaching the mark from 128 to 129. At this moment, an overweight student was twirling a smartphone in his left hand, on the screen of which something was depicted. The guy put his right hand in his pocket and pulled a smug smile. As it turned out, the character showed him a video of his jumps, curious in advance that he had really forgotten about him. Moreover, all this time Cha Mu-yeol kept all these videos and photos in which classmates made fun of him. From this information, horror froze on Beak Ju-song's face, which was accentuated by the shadow on his eyes. And at the last moment, the guy uttered words according to which it was not his life that was destroyed, but his abuser, that is, Beak Ju-song. New comments poured in. Based on them, people began to doubt the veracity and authenticity of the video, but others now called the victim not a bully, but the main character. Readers may have noticed how two policemen led away a school bandit, leaving behind only a long shadow. That's just some commentators wondered why they did something like that over Cha Mu-yeol if he was good in battle. Moreover, they could not come to a unanimous conclusion who made him an outcast, making the audacious assumption that it was Beak Ju-song, whose bloodied face still reflected fear. According to the viewers of the live broadcast, it was a good way to educate bullies. One of them, with his eyes wide open, was trying to come to his senses. Suddenly, an overweight character entered the dialogue. He said out loud that Malcolm X had once said that his attacks were not called elimination when it was done for defensive purposes. This is the carrier of the name of intelligence. The main character, with a confident expression on his face, said that he had been an outcast for a long time. Money was taken from him. They made fun of him almost every day. And that was the reason why he learned to box, to be a reasonable person. After these words, the story focused on his fist. Apparently, it was difficult for the guy to talk about it. Of course, Cha Mu-yeol was willing to gladly accept any punishment for what he did today, but he just wanted everyone to know that what the character did was a way of self-defense. The schoolboy lowered his head because he was remorseful. Moreover, after some time of silence, it became known that the main character, studying martial arts, found what he really wanted to do. The school bullies, Beak Ju-song's friends, watched Cha Mu-yeol's actions with open mouths, even when he said that he wanted to become stronger. The reason was not only that the guy wanted to be free from fun, but he wanted to be able to fight with more experienced people. At that moment, Yeon-mina said out loud that the number of viewers continued to grow, which greatly pleased her. The main character said that this was the reason why he would like to take part in the real fighter. Such reaction and attitude of Cha Mu-yeol excited commentators who considered it a good ending for the story. Moreover, everyone expressed words of support to him. In the next episode, the picture focuses readers' attention on a bright room, in the middle of which there was a huge wooden table, behind which sat a silhouette in a gray suit. On the contrary, he had a character in brown. He gathered both hands behind his back and watched his interlocutor. As it turned out, the two men were watching a live broadcast on which Cha Mu-yeol dealt a crushing blow to Beak Ju-song. It was Jang Yong-gil. Even if it was just a coincidence, the situation looked strange. At that moment, the commentators called the name of Cha Mu-yeol. They believe that if the guy trains more, he has every chance to become better than another person with the same name. The character in the brown suit said that it was really strange, because even their fighting style was similar. Readers got acquainted with the secretary of the head of the RFC office, Woo Hyun-chul. Jang Yong-gil replied to him, saying that Cha Mu-yeol was not one of those who would secretly train a successor because he was too busy fighting and training, and so he made an offer to visit him. However, the secretary made it clear that the main character was still a minor. Moreover, it could have a bad effect on middle and high school students. The gray-haired man asked him if Mr. Java knew the principle of their business, because the goal was not to be clean, but to make money by giving people what they wanted to see. They have always loved to watch fights, since the days of dog fights and fights in basements. This instinct did not weaken. However, Cha Yong-gil guaranteed that even the minister would be watching their real fighter. In the next episode, the story described a group of guys who were in the locker room, as well as viewers with cameras. Han Gi-ju said that 3 strikes were made in 2 minutes, which was too difficult for the first qualifying round. However, Kang Hae-min didn't think so, because if you look at Chang Chun-min, Ba Krasin, Ki Won-gi, they fought at the appropriate levels. The girl replied that even considering 1 hit, it is a miracle. But the guy didn't understand why they considered 3 necessary. As it turned out, President Chan developed these requirements to make it easier for him to choose a fighter. They came to the conclusion that he was old-fashioned. Han Kai-ju asked if Cha Mu-yeol would succeed, hoping that he would show his best side. Now he was the creator of martial arts issues. However, the girl saw someone, which made both of them turn their heads. She thought she saw Cha Mu-yeol, but the guy thought they should have interviewed him. Except it turned out to be true. The main character said that he was now in his best condition. The story begins on the street of a nocturnal, but at the same time bright city in a building with a burning sign Karaokezilla. The guy walks along a brightly lit corridor, along many doors, confidently and very loudly stomping, as if he had been here thousands of times. With a creak, he enters one of the rooms illuminated by the rays of a karaoke ball. There are 3 girls sitting in the room, dressed in school uniforms. Jess, clearly dissatisfied with something, sits in silence and crosses her arms over her chest, while her friends cheerfully sing. The guy who came in a loud voice, informs Jess that the guys from the next room consider them cuties and offer to relax together. Jess continues to sit silently and dissatisfied. He, apparently expecting such a reaction, begins to persuade, saying that they already gave them free soda and extra karaoke time, and that they just need to sit with those guys for a couple of minutes. But again, not seeing the reaction he needed, he suddenly and abruptly grabs Jess by the hand and pulls her out from behind the table. She angrily mutters to herself about some loser that he has no balls, since he can't call them himself. Abruptly, Jess breaks down and moves on to the guy standing next to her. She shouts at him so that the loser does not even hope and hits him hard in the groin. The stunned guy falls to the floor and looks up pityingly. Jess puts her hands on her waist, showing her superiority with all her appearance, and explains that she is the ex-girlfriend of Bao Gao, the strongest in Incheon Chinatown. She rudely tells him to go and tell him that if he is better than her ex, then let him come and get acquainted himself, otherwise let him go to hell. Staggering, the guy got up and headed towards the exits. Jess was still glaring after him angrily. Anger faded into the background. Jess was sweating from such an active dialogue. She unbuttoned her blouse and invited her friends to sing something to distract themselves. After leaving the room, the guy felt depressed. He walked along and muttered to himself with displeasure that she was no longer dating Bao, but was still using his name. Suddenly he heard footsteps. A boy was walking down the corridor and humming to himself. When he passed by, he began to ask in a raised tone how he got here and for him to get out. The boy shuddered and, pretending that he did not understand, asked why he could not come here. The karaoke worker was enraged by such impudence, pointing and waving his hands, began to shout that he was constantly getting into fights with his visitors, and on his first visit he broke the TV altogether. The boy made a cute face, and calling him a brother, tried to convey that he really came just to sing songs. He said he would try to leave as soon as possible. Because of this reception, the employee's face changed to a dirty one. But then he stopped abruptly. His heart began to beat very fast. He was scared and wondered what was wrong with him, because he was a guy. The employee, turning away in embarrassment, directed the boy to room 6, but warned him, let him only dare to leave ahead of time. The boy was obviously pleased with this. He headed down the corridor, but when he heard a beautiful singing at the 5th room, he joined the class. He saw 3 girls dancing, but Jess immediately took all his attention. The pretty boy was surprised how attractive she is, but she looks a little arrogant, but this only gives a special peppercorn. As he opened the door, he decided that she was his target for today. Going inside the room, he shouted cheerfully. He asked why the girls were sitting alone and noticed that it was not interesting at all. Jess, tired of dancing, plopped down on the sofa. Her friends stood in disbelief and looked at the guy. He sat down next to Jess, winked at her and, as always, making a cute face, asked if she would mind if he joined, because they would definitely not get bored with him. Jess's friends were amazed by the boy's cute appearance. They noticed that he was their type. And here's the moment, they're already having fun together. The guy sings, and Jess's friends are spinning next to him in the dance. In turn, Jess is still resting and enjoying a drink. At this time, a red-haired guy came to the door. He got mad when he saw Jess hanging out with some guy. He bursts into the room and shouts to the pretty boy that he was the first to look at her and how dare he cross his path. The red-haired man grabs him by the collar and offers to sort it out like a man. The cutie agrees. It makes the red-haired man laugh a lot. He says that it's not worth showing off in front of the girls. But suddenly he himself blushes from the cute appearance of the boy. Suddenly, the cutie's face changes. He grabs the hand of a cheeky guy and wrings it. The red-haired one was surprised and screams how he dared to push him. But then he gets an elbow right in the chest. The cheeky guy fell to the floor. The cutie smugly straightened his hair and noticed that his opponent had no strength at all. Barely getting up, the red-haired guy said that he would kill this bastard and he did not know who he was. Standing up, he swung and shouted that he was in the 10th place of the highest to Suksu, and that he would soon overthrow Bao, and become the strongest dog in Ikan. A door swung open from behind. The red-haired man only had time to turn around as the fist of the cutie bumps into his face. Blood gushed out of his nose, and the red-haired guy swung again and wanted to hit. But his hand was intercepted again. This time it was a guy who had recently entered. He turned to the pretty boy, calling him Harper Van, and handed him a piece of paper. A smile appeared on the face of the newcomer, more like a grin. He squeezed the red-haired guy's hand hard. Inside, the red-haired man screamed. He did not understand who he was and where he got so much power from. But fortunately for him, the guest casually released his hand and returned to Harper. The humiliated, impudent guy again burned with a desire for revenge. Shouting at the new enemy, he swung and struck. The hand did not reach the target again. The black-haired stranger dodged the blow as if he knew it would happen. The stranger grabbed the red-haired man and pulled him towards himself. Daring did not even have time to inhale, as a knee flies into his stomach. He exhaled heavily and sharply. A tear rolled down his face. The stranger turned to Harper, said that if he fights with such assholes, then you need to beat the shit out of them. Then they definitely won't bother. During his speech, he did what he beat the red-haired one, first hitting him on the top of his head, and then finally and at full speed pushing his head into the wall. The red-haired man fell to the floor in a puddle of his own blood and sighed heavily. And the black-haired stranger stood and looked at him with his terrifying smile. Everyone was surprised by what this black-haired guy did to him. The black-haired man headed for the exit of the room. Stopping at the door, he called Harper with him. A bright night street. A red bike with a black-haired guy and Harper rushes along the road. Harper presses hard against the stranger sitting in front. They stop before the traffic light. Harper says he's glad his father sent him a watchdog as a gift. After all, he had wanted a bodyguard for so long. His watchdog said that Harper can think as he wants, and he's just doing his job. He also asked Harper not to stick, because it's disgusting. The black-haired man asked if Harper was really a guy or if everyone here was wearing makeup. Harper slyly made eyes and decided to tease his doggy. Harper pressed hard against him, causing a blush to appear on the black-haired man's face. The black-haired man got very angry and shouted what he was doing. Turning and taking off his helmet, the black-haired man probably wanted to smack Harper, but turning Harper joined his lips. The black-haired man screamed sharply and asked, and Harper kept teasing, saying he didn't understand why he couldn't kiss him, because he had to mark what was his. The bodyguard looked at Harper with horror and embarrassment, and he did not calm down and said that he liked him. The guy slowly and aesthetically wipes his lips with his hand. He looks sharply at Harper and says with disgust and as if with contempt that really one kiss was not enough. Harper, still hoping for a continuation of the kiss, stands with his eyes closed and pulls his lips, asks if he wants to do it again. The guy is disgusted with this picture, puts his hand on his friend's head and pointedly turns away, asking him to remove his nasty face, which is just disgusting. The guy casually points his finger in his direction and says that he warns that he does not like it when others treat him like that. Orders him not to do that anymore. Harper looks lustfully and says with a grin that he does not understand what is the matter and that he can do anything he wants. But still, since his puppy asks, he will think about it. After looking at Harper again with displeasure, the guy repeats that he warned. He turns away, lowers the visor of his helmet and starts his red bike. The black-haired man, before turning away, said that he did not give anyone a second chance and that Harper could do as he knew. The green lights up. The black-haired man pushes the throttle handle and the bike quickly starts, getting on the rear wheel. This speed makes Harper very happy, and he shouts joyfully. There is a light on the first floor of a tall white building. Outside the door, there are sounds of blows and sighs. The red-haired guy was beaten with a bat on the 5th point by his brother. He was saying that how did this fool dare to hit on the former Bao Guo without his permission. The red-haired man tried to justify himself that he just wanted to avenge Bao for him, for taking the place of the strongest dog in northern Aiken. The brother kept shouting that he was crazy, that the red-haired one was nobody to oppose Bao. Finally, his brother said that Bao is not a man, but a monster, because he was able to get his hands on the northern and southern parts of Aiken in less than a week. A picture popped up in their thoughts, a hefty big man standing among a pile of bodies lying in blood. Bao is really dangerous. My brother sat down heavily on a chair and covered his face with his hand. He kept saying that he didn't understand who the fool thought he was. He looked at the red-haired man and asked if there were any Bao people there. He was told that they did not think so. Getting up, he said it was good. The red-haired one and some other kids stood and looked at the floor. The elder told them not to do this again. Suddenly, footsteps were heard in the corridor. A healthy guy came into the hall. It was Sam, Bao's right-hand man. His job was to pass orders to Bao, punish people, and collect taxes. Sam said he had a message from Bao. He took the cross-haired brother by the throat and lifted him up. He said that there should be a reckoning for betrayal. Wheezing from suffocation, he began to justify himself that this was no betrayal. You'd think he hit on the former Bao Guyu. He said that his brother was still small and that he would take care of him. Sam pulled the poor guy to his face and said that he knew that the red-haired man thought he could become the strongest in Ikan. Rolling his eyes, he added that lying carries even more punishment. Sam slowly swung, slapped the poor guy in the face. The blow was so strong that he immediately went limp, and blood sprayed in all directions. He casually let go of the limp body, and it fell senselessly to the floor and rolled a couple of meters. The brother of the red-haired man showed no signs of life, and the others, except Sam, of course, stood and looked with fear at the body, then at Sam himself. Sam looked in the direction of the small ones and said that from that day on, Suksu High School occupies the lowest place among the northern Ikan, and their tax is doubled. Grinning, he turned away and slowly walked to the exit, warning that no one was given a second chance and that next time he might be ordered to kill them. The red-haired man runs up and tries to bring his brother to his senses, but it is clear from his lost face that it will not work. The red-haired man shouts that he will definitely take revenge. Sam turns around with a sneer and says that in order to get revenge, he must become stronger and find Bao. But first he will have to defeat him. Showing with all his appearance that the kid is pathetic, Sam says that if he has the guts, then they can fight at any time. Sam laughed loudly and expressively. A tall apartment building floods the street with light from the windows. Harper's joyful cry is heard from behind the door. The boss is surprised at how quickly Kyle was able to bring Harper, and that Hyper probably has nothing to worry about at school. Kyle replies indifferently that it doesn't matter at all and he'd rather rest. With this answer, he caused surprise among the boss and his subordinates. Kyle headed for the exit, but the boss said he needed to get ready for his school visit tomorrow. Kyle turns around and asks in disbelief if they're joking, because he doesn't even go to school. To which the boss says that because of the fight in the club, Harper was expelled. After looking at the boss, Kyle turns and, hanging his head in despair, begins to leave, and the boss continues to say that the watchdog should follow his master everywhere. The boss adds that he has heard that things are not going smoothly at Hong Jin High School, so Kyle should go. Hearing the name of the school, Kyle turns sharply and looks at the boss with horror. The boss wonders if even Kyle has heard of this school. Arrogantly lifting his chin, Kyle said that there is no person in Incheon who has not heard of her. There are only scum studying there. Adjusting his sunglasses, the boss noticed that there are scum not only from Incheon, but also from all over the country. It also seems that the Triad from Incheon, Sangses from North Gyeonggi and Blue Dragons from South Gyeonggi are recruiting new gang members. There are a lot of fights going on. The boss approached Kyle and said in a confident tone that he was obliged to protect Harper. Closing his eyes with discontent, Kyle asked to stop repeating it to him. The boss told Kyle that he would be living in Didong, a city located opposite Hong Jin, and told Harper to show Kyle their house. Harper happily strode down the hall and called Kyle, saying that the puppy should follow him. Kyle turns around and hopefully asks if he's really going to live with him until graduation. Then, it dawned on him that this was not a joke and angrily shouted that they were doing terrible things. That night in Didong, Harper shows Kyle their new house. Harper explained that Dad wanted to give Kyle a room at the end of the corridor, but he insisted and they would live in 301 and 302. As he dialed the door code, Harper was feigning surprise that Kyle didn't want to live closer to him. Entering the house, Harper called Kyle inside because he wants to see his room. Walking down the hall, Harper told me that Dad had arranged the room to his liking. At that moment, a guy bumped into Harper with his shoulder. Harper curled his lips in displeasure and looking after the offender said that it hurt. Kyle immediately found himself on the street with a wild desire to teach the assholes a lesson. He shouted at them to stop. The guys, not understanding how someone dared to call out to them, turned around and looked gloomily at Kyle. Kyle repeated his words with obvious anger in his voice, ordering them to stop. One of the guys turned around with a misunderstanding and asked if Kyle was crazy. With a haughty face, the same guy stood up in a relaxed pose and waved his hand impressively, telling Kyle to stop showing off in front of his boyfriend and get out, because they are from the highest Hong Jin. The second guy turned to a friend with a sneer, telling him to score, because Kyle would still end up in the hospital if he didn't stop climbing to the guys from Hong Jin. The first one spat at Kyle's feet and, indignant, was about to leave. Kyle said in the same unwavering voice that he was repeating to the guys for the last time and they should apologize. One of the guys becomes enraged and rushes at Kyle screaming. He launches his fist right into Kyle's face. There is a dull sound of impact, but Kyle intercepted his hand right in front of his nose. The recently fierce guy loses all resolve from his face. He looks into Kyle's eyes in surprise. In them he sees all the same calmness and steadfastness. Kyle squeezes his hand tighter and rings his fist with force. Sweat and a grimace of pain immediately appeared on the guy's face. But Kyle kept pushing. The guy screamed in pain and ended up on his knees. Kyle was looking at him with a sinister smile. Kyle notices that the kid is screaming very loudly and that the more he yells, the more scum will find out about him. With that sinister expression on his face, Kyle continued to press his hand, saying that the more people know about him, the more they will be afraid, which means it will be easier for him to protect Harper. Kyle pressed the poor guy's hand even harder and began to mockingly tell him to scream more, even louder. A long and nasty scream resounded throughout the entire block of the night, but brightly burning city. The second guy watched with apprehension as Kyle tormented his friend. Abruptly shouting that Kyle was a freak, the guy ran at him. The guy hits with all his strength, but the blow whizzes through the air. Kyle was able to dodge with ease. In the process of the slope, Kyle looks at the boy with hatred and appraisingly and makes a sharp dive. The top of Kyle's head at full speed and with a whoosh crashes into the jaw of a high school greyhound. Blood splattered to the side, and the high school student flew back. Kyle stands and arrogantly examines the body that has fallen to the ground. The first guy kneels behind Kyle. He begins to pronounce apologies with difficulty, saying that they will never catch his friend's eye again. The guy begged for forgiveness. Kyle kept looking at the guy sitting on his lap, thinking to himself that they were all animals and that they would definitely tell their gang about him. In his head, he came to the conclusion that until they met someone stronger, they would run away with their tails between their legs at the sight of Kyle. But Kyle has one problem. He's being watched by some guys at the end of the alley. He looks back cautiously, without turning around. These guys are clearly from the same gang as these. If they are lower in rank, they will forget about it. But if they are higher, they will definitely come back for Kyle to take revenge. Kyle had a big smile on his face. His heart hadn't been beating so hard for a long time. Abruptly, Harper gently grabbed Kyle's arm and gently pulled him towards himself. Harper spoke happily, glad that his puppy stood up for him. Kyle pulled his hand away and screamed at Harper not to dare touch him. Harper put his arm around Kyle again and pressed against his arm. Taking Kyle into the house, Harper said with a sly smile that he knew what Kyle liked and he would cook him delicious tteokbokki according to his signature recipe. A red-haired guy was standing at the end of the alley, talking on the phone. He mockingly said that a very interesting guy had moved to their city. At the end of the conversation, he abruptly lowered the timbre of his voice and said that Bao and Sam would be very interested in learning about him. Bright sunny morning. The action begins at Hong Jin High School. From the outside it looked like a decent school, but inside everything is much worse. There is a tense situation in class 1-9. All the dregs of this class are stone-faced and silently waiting for the lesson to begin. All the faces of the students of this school have stone and evil faces, and only arrogance and pride can be read in their eyes. The door to the classroom opens loudly. The darkly dressed Kyle enters first, looks at the sitting students from under his brows with displeasure. He immediately gathers the attention of all the scum. They look at him with arrogant defiance. With a look full of confidence and detachment, Kyle begins to make his way inside the classroom. Harper silently follows him. All the scum immediately got up from their seats and blocked the passage, appraisingly and proudly examining the newcomers who had recently entered. Walking along the desks, Kyle argues that if you drive all the dogs that got into the senior Hong Jin, they will not immediately show their teeth, but first build their defense. Approaching the desk he needed, he came to the conclusion that all the students trapped in this school are wild dogs. After briefly looking at an empty desk, Kyle takes up a chair to push it away, but someone's sneaker abruptly rests against it. Kyle examines the student who dared to do this, and then only looks back proudly with pleasure. Suddenly, the chair flies to another part of the classroom, and this guy starts aggressively pointing and shouting that this is his place, and that Kyle should get out. Kyle thinks it seems like it's already started. Harper looks calmly at Kyle. Harper lowers her face, grabs Kyle's elbow and offers to just sit in another place. Not agreeing with Harper's suggestion, Kyle continues to stand and defiantly look at this garbage. Kyle reflects that this jerk chose the weakest looking one to prove to the others that he is worth something. The guy continues to stare defiantly at Kyle and shouts that what the hell is he staring at him for. Kyle concludes that he wants to make a scapegoat out of him. After all, if he loses, then all the hyenas will run to him and it will be more difficult for him to protect Harper. Besides, Kyle is not a fan of embarrassing himself. Kyle abruptly and casually knocks Harper's hand off, says he doesn't care and continues to stand still. Scum, feeling his vague superiority, continues to press Kyle, asking if he is a local because he speaks very funny. A haughty grin stretches across the scum's face. Kyle says he just grew up in Siberia, grew up in the Primorsky territory and hunted tigers there. The trash walks around Kyle, leans on his shoulder and sarcastically says that this can't happen. How such a manner of conversation can appear because of the tigers. The trash leans into Kyle's ear and says threateningly that he thinks Kyle is a foreign asshole with a funny accent who is trying to piss him off. Kyle, without flinching a muscle on his face, asks the trash to move away because he stinks from his mouth. Surprised by such impudence, the trash begins to get angry. He swings and says that Kyle apparently wants to die. With all his might, the asshole prescribes a slap on the back of Kyle's head. The blow reaches the target and a ringing sound rushes through the class. Holding Kyle's head, the asshole bends down and slowly, through his teeth, says that Kyle really pisses him off. The rest of the assholes in the class look at this picture arrogantly and quiet. Harper looks at Kyle with excitement. With one sharp blow of his elbow, Kyle knocks off the hand of the impudent scum and turns to face him. Fear abruptly appeared on the scum's face. Kyle defiantly asks the asshole to hit him, says that everyone is looking at and isn't that what he wanted. With the same unwavering face, Kyle firmly and loudly asks the trash to attack. Gradually bending under the iron character of Kyle, the discard hesitantly takes a step back and asks what kind of nonsense Kyle is talking about. But Kyle does not let him finish. With a smile on his face, he pushes the garbage with his forehead into his chest and with feigned surprise asks what happened to him and why he does not attack. Feeling the reaction to his words, Kyle very timely and abruptly takes a step back. At this time, the trash screams at the top of his voice how dare Kyle lean on him, and hits Kyle with all his might. But the blow does not have time to reach its destination, because Kyle managed to be the first to hit the garbage right in the face with all his might. The dull sound of a blow replaces the silence in the classroom. With a proud face and mockery in his voice, the garbage asks what it was, not that Kyle hit him, but suddenly blood splashes on his hand. Surprised, the trash raises his hand to his face and realizes that it is his blood. Angered so much that even the veins swelled on his temples, the garbage begins to move towards Kyle and says that he will definitely kill him. Screaming, he swings and flies at full speed towards Kyle, while he stands calmly and keeps his hands in his pockets, not feeling any danger at all. Thanks to his excellent reaction, Kyle sees the blows of the garbage as if in slow motion. Kyle makes a sharp lunge to the side, again dodging a blow to the end of the furious garbage. Kyle, without thinking twice, hits the garbage in the jaw at full speed and with all his strength. Something crunched very loudly. Recently, a greyhound, full of anger and self-confidence, throws his head back and flies to the floor. Blood splatters on the floor. Kyle, proudly looking down at the work done, calmly passes next to the lying body. He impressively walks past the students staring at him, because he knows that after such a thing, no one will dare even say a word to him. Kyle pushes back his chair and sits down with a sense of accomplishment. He looks at the enthusiastic and amazed Harper. Kyle asks why Harper is standing there and not sitting down. Kyle pushes back the second chair and says that now the place next to him is always his. Harper cautiously approaches and sits down at his desk. Next to his watchdog, he feels safe. Harper turns to Kyle and says it's very scary here. He worries that everyone is looking at him and whether they will be alright. Kyle looks with his unwavering gaze at the scum staring at them. In normal schools, after this, the hierarchy has already been established, but not here. The scum with grins and defiance in their eyes look at them as their prey, but still, they won't climb for a while. The door opens with a bang. A big guy appears in the aisle. All the attention from Harper and Kyle immediately switches to the door. The trash walks into the classroom, slams his hands on the table with a bang and shouts why the assholes are staring at him. He keeps shouting that he is Brett Moon, the strongest at the Gwangjin school in Seoul, and they should show him their respect. The trash loudly asks who is the strongest in their class. Kyle did not expect this, due to the fact that the senior Hong Jin is being thrown off from all over the country. There is a completely different atmosphere here. Kyle bends forward and a satisfied grin appears on his face. School life promises to be interesting for him. Surprised by the arrogance of the scum, Brett looked down on the class, believing that they were all weaklings and simply pretending to be cool. Silence still reigned in the classroom. The rest of the scum were still looking at Brett, who came into the classroom with arrogance. A satisfied grin appeared on Kyle's face. He noticed that Brett was different from that guy. That trash was looking for the weakest. Brett was looking for the strongest. The situation became even more tense. Brett continued to look down on the students, seeming to understand that he would not wait for an answer to his question. Brett, without turning his head, looked with determined eyes for the strongest in the class, visually and mentally assessing everyone. When Brett began to inspect the garbage, each of them had a satisfied grin, pleased that they are challenging Brett, albeit visually. The situation was heating up. Then Brett's eyes widened. He turned his head sharply and saw Kyle sitting at the end of the class. Kyle had a scary expression on his face, scary, but eerily pleased. Kyle mentally screamed how glad he was that he knew Brett would find him. The silence in the classroom abruptly began to fill with someone's calm steps. Kyle looked away in surprise and incomprehension to examine this brave man. A guy was walking along the desks with a calm smile on his face. Kyle looked at his back with displeasure. The guy walked up to the desk where Brett was sitting and began to look at him with interest. Brett didn't notice him and was looking at something to the side. Then this guy laughed at the whole class. He asked with joy and, it seems, with kindness in his voice, "Is it really Brett?" With a smug face, the guy said that he was expelled from Brett's school back in middle school. Then he was his high school student. The guy was glad to meet someone from the old school. He said they could be friends and held out his hand. Still believing in his authority in front of Brett, the guy bent down to him and said that he would help him with school life and guide him. Brett turned his gaze on the guy and asked with anger in his voice, "So what?" The guy's expression immediately changed. Sweat broke out on his temples. With fear, he looked at Brett questioningly. Brett, with a stony face, looked at the guy with all the anger. He asked what he cared about the fact that he studied with him at the same school. Brett, with a furious face, looked at the guy and shouted that they were no longer at school in Seoul. He said that now they are in the higher Hong Jin, and this is a completely different world. The guy scratched his head uncertainly and said in a noticeably quieter voice that he just wanted to make friends. Brett arrogantly turned away and said that if he wanted to make friends, then let him carry his bag and not think that it was better just because he was older. Continuing to scratch the back of his head uncertainly, the guy sighed and agreed in a trembling voice. He probably imagined himself to be Brett's brother, but turned out to be his errand boy. What a shame. Brett continued to look at Kyle sitting at the end of the class. Kyle's satisfied smile reappeared on his face. Kyle confidently stood up from his desk. Harper noticed this and looked at Kyle with excitement. Harper, startled, grabbed Kyle by the arm and asked him to sit still, because he shouldn't do it. Kyle silently looked down at Harper. He explained to Harper that he had to protect him, and to do that he had to be strong. He said that you gain strength when you prove it to others, so now is the time to show it. Harper continued to look at Kyle with excitement. He sighed and, touched, asked if Kyle was doing this for him. A scarlet flush appeared on Harper's face. Thoughts swirled in Harper's head. He likes it. Kyle walked calmly and steadily towards his prey. Brett watched him unflinchingly. The scum in the class made a fuss. They began to mock that this upstart wanted to show himself again. They came to the conclusion that this time it will not be so easy for Kyle, because his opponent is the strongest dog from school in Seoul. Kyle was walking towards Brett, looking unwaveringly into his eyes. Brett raised his hand to his face and thought. Brett leaned on his arm and looked at Kyle with a haughty face. Brett said that Kyle had balls of steel. Brett was looking at Kyle with interest, who didn't look as strong as he seemed. He went on to say that usually everyone gets scared when they hear his name. Brett was even interested. Brett approvingly said that before he entered the classroom, he saw Kyle knock out that guy and that if after that he thought he was strong, then it was better for Kyle to return to his place. Brett tensed all the muscles of his face, the veins on his temples bulged, and began to stare intently at Kyle, waiting for a response. Kyle, without flinching a single muscle of his body, said that they would still see who would return to his place, because only one would stand. Kyle smugly remarked that he had never missed his prey, that this was his territory, and Brett was his prey. Looking haughtily at Brett, Kyle lowered the timbre of his voice and slowly asked if Brett understood him. Brett stood up resolutely, a satisfied smile on his face. Abruptly, Brett launches his crushing punch into Kyle's face. This time Kyle didn't have time to react. Consciousness went into his heels for a second, but immediately came back. Kyle rubbed his chin, where the blow had just gone, and just as emotionlessly looked at Brett as if nothing had happened. Surprised, but enough that he found a strong opponent. Brett was surprised. Kyle was the first who stood on his feet after his blow. Kyle continued to nag Brett with his gaze. Kyle replied that Brett was the first person in Korea who was able to punch him in the face. Fired up by these words, Brett cracked his fingers and said that if so, he would be the first to knock him out. Shouting furiously that he would show why no one could beat him, Brett struck a second time. This time Kyle saw and calculated all the slightest movements of the greyhound asshole, so he definitely could not miss this blow. Brett suddenly felt fear. He was scared because his fist did not reach the target, and Kyle was right next to him, preparing for a retaliatory blow. Kyle immediately grabbed Brett's head and, at full speed, with all the force and inertia of his body, hit Brett from the knee into the nose. Blood sprayed in different directions. Brett immediately dropped out of consciousness. His unconscious body tipped over backwards and flew down. Brett, covered in blood, collapsed on his desk. The desk could not withstand his heavy weight and broke in half. Brett's lifeless body sprawled on the floor. Arrogantly examining the fallen victim, Kyle repeated that Brett was the first in Korea who was able to hit him in the face, because they were already lying on the floor as Brett was lying now. There was an ominous silence in the classroom. Everyone silently and in surprise looked at the defeated Brett, and the desks scattered to the sides. The whole situation, looking out of the classroom window, was watched by a group of some guys. All the scum around them, looking at them, fell into horror. These guys began to slowly leave. Moving along the corridor, the surrounding people looked at their backs with fear. As they walked, everyone in the corridor lined up along the walls so as not to accidentally bump into them. One of them was talking on the phone, explaining that Chris was calling. He told someone that Kyle, about whom he was talking, appeared at their school and beat the first recruit of their organization and something needs to be done with him. Chris offered options for action, saying that he could be shut up, recruited, but significantly lowering his voice. He added that he thought it would be better to kill him. Chris arranged to meet on the roof by phone, and the guys went there. The dean entered the classroom and leaned on the desk. Her strong hands gripped the desk tightly, so much so that the veins on them swelled. Glaring angrily at the class, she said in her steely voice that she was not going to explain anything, because everyone knows about the reputation of Hong Jin High School, into which all the scum of the country are thrown. She said that Class 10-9 consists of those who were expelled from previous schools and that Hong Jin gives them one last chance. Everyone in the class listened intently. The school could turn a blind eye to some things, but if they give up at least once, they will regret it. The dean conveyed this idea to everyone very clearly. Looking at the dean, who was huge and pleased that everyone was afraid of her, Harper carefully whispered to Kyle that she was called a white dog and that she had once broken a student's arm. Harper abruptly straightened up and sat up straight. He whispered to Kyle that she was looking right at them, and fell silent. Collecting her documents, the dean peered at each sitting student. Kyle, as always, calmly turned around and told Harper that there was nothing to be afraid of, because she was an ordinary person. Summing up her speech, the dean said that from the next lesson, the headman would call everyone to the dean's office one by one for a personal conversation. Haughtily, as if showing her superiority, she looked at the girl sitting on the first desk and temporarily appointed her headman. She agreed good-naturedly, as if she had a choice. The bell rang. The students relaxed and went about their business. Of course, after such a tense monologue, the dean needed to rest. Kyle and Harper sat quietly at the desk and stared at her without an emotional look. The girl who was appointed temporary headman came up to them. Harper drew attention to her. The girl leaned over and greeted Harper sweetly. Harper recognized her. It was Carol Yu. Harper jumped up from his seat and they hugged happily. He said he was glad that she was also transferred to this school. Carol sat down in the next chair. He and Harper talked happily, remembering that this was their first meeting since the incident. Harper said he was very happy that they were in the same class. Carol was also happy about it. Saying this to Harper, they both smiled good-naturedly. Kyle was still sitting in silence, but then he asked who she was. The girl emotionally asked Kyle the same question. Harper gave Kyle a smug look and said his daddy had hired him a bodyguard. Kyle sighed in despair. Harper decided to introduce them. He said that this was his best friend Carol. They were very close in the last school. They got into trouble together, and that's why they were expelled. Harper added that Carol lived nearby, so she has a lot of friends at this school. She could be useful to them. The girl agreed with Harper, rolled her eyes, crossed her arms over her chest, and asked Kyle to be nice to her. Carol called Harper into the dining room because there would soon be a queue there. Harper agreed, and they headed for the exit. Kyle sat for a couple of seconds and also got up. Two guys were standing at the exit, laughing and discussing a white dog, with its very muscular arms and pimples, which attacks the students like a warthog. The face of one of the guys was filled with anger. He blocked Harper's way and defiantly asked what he was staring at. The second scum supported his friend and asked what Harper needed. Harper's face paled and sweat broke out on his temples. Carol hid behind him in fright. Suddenly, Kyle's big palm appeared in the doorway and froze for a second at the head of one of the scum. Kyle came out and with his strong hands, abruptly and forcefully, pushed the scum standing in the doorway. The greyhound of the pair loudly and angrily asked what kind of freak did that. Turning around, the trash immediately fell silent. Kyle was looking at him, and his friend was already shaking with fear. Kyle asked what they had against what he needed to go through. With fear in their eyes, the dregs parted in the corners. Nervously scratching the back of his head, the trash replied that he didn't mind and that the door was shared, which meant Kyle could pass. Carol exclaimed that they had to hurry, because they were late. He and Harper ran. Kyle stood and reasoned. He knocked out 2 of the class 10-9, showing his strength. While Harper and Carol were running happily, all the scum in the corridor were looking at them with anger and ridicule. Everyone looked at Kyle standing in the hallway. Kyle doesn't know how much longer his class will be afraid of him. But the main problem is that he doesn't know what kind of types study in other classes. With their noses up high, contorting smug faces, the dregs of the Hong Jin school looked at Kyle with burning eyes, considering him their victim. Kyle closed his eyes and exhaled heavily, as if he was back in the forests of Primorsky Krai. And he was alone again. In Kyle's mind, he remembered the cold night, the bright moon, and the wild animals looking with their bloodthirsty eyes. In a region where the temperature reaches -30, the strongest survives. Kyle thought again of the wolves with bloodshot eyes. Kyle's eyes sparkled with nostalgia and a pleasant feeling. He voluntarily came to a place full of wild animals. There was a small queue in the canteen building. Everyone was animatedly discussing what they wanted for lunch. The good-natured saleswoman with a kind smile handed Kyle 2 hot ramen. It smells very tasty. Harper and Carol sat down at the table and were about to enjoy their ramen when Carol exclaimed in surprise and looked at another table. Carol nudges Harper and asks him to look at Kyle. Harper, surprised, turns his attention to another table. Kyle sits alone at the table and silently eats his bread. However, not surprisingly, he has always been aloof. Carol's face changes to a dirty one. A smile and a scarlet blush appear on her face. She says Kyle is cute and exactly her type. Carol stops talking and continues to look at Kyle. Harper is happily supportive. He also thinks Kyle is a hot thing. Harper's words abruptly unsettle Carol. She tells him that sometimes he behaves incorrectly. Carol throws her head back and begins to think. She can't say that Harper doesn't like girls, because he's already hooked up with one at the club. Carol slyly and sharply asked Harper if he was bisexual. Harper paled at the question, and he turned and looked at Carol. Then Harper looked down. A blush appeared on his face. He embarrassedly said that he was not gay, but meant that if he was a girl, then Kyle would be to his liking. Carol bent down to Harper's face, slyly narrowing her eyes. Carol asked if Harper was hiding something from her. Harper exclaimed, startled, that he wasn't. Carol stood up confidently, looked at the embarrassed Harper with a smile and said that it was great and Kyle was hers now. Harper's eyes suddenly widened, and there was panic in them. He looked at Carol walking with a confident gait. Kyle sat unsuspectingly and washed down the eaten bun with juice. Carol came over and put her arm around him and lay on his shoulder. Kyle stopped drinking, looked sideways at a satisfied Carol and asked what she was doing. Making a cute face, Carol pulled herself up to Kyle's face and in a charming voice invited Kyle to eat ramen with them. Because you won't be satisfied with bread alone, she even offered him to eat her portion. Kyle continued to sit without emotion, when suddenly someone approached him from behind. Carol grunted with displeasure, because her attempt at a tackle would probably be ruined. 3 guys came up to their table. They asked if he was the same Kyle. Kyle looked at them in surprise. One of the guys was familiar to Kyle. It was the trash he knocked out first. The guy with yellow hair asked if Kyle knocked out his friend. He introduced himself as the strongest dog from class 10-1. The third supported the acquaintance and called himself the strongest dog from class 10-2. The dog from 10-1 says with a grin, did Kyle run away from class and decided to hide in the cafeteria? Suddenly, he forcefully leans his foot on the table. Ramen falls to the floor. Someone screamed in surprise. Kyle was still calm and unwavering in his seat. Angrily, the dog from 10-1 bent down to Kyle's face and asked where he wanted to solve the issue, in the dining room or on the street. Kyle, as if not noticing the garbage, continued to sit quietly and reflect on the fact that all the wild dogs hiding in the classrooms are slowly beginning to show themselves. It's even good. Today Kyle will get his hands on all the second grades. Kyle stood up abruptly. The dregs flinched in surprise and stared at him. All the students in the dining room were bustling. There was a commotion in the dining room. Someone shouted that a fight was starting. The students surrounded Kyle and the 3 dregs. The scum looked at Kyle with malice, apparently not feeling the danger. Very wrong. Kyle tilted his head a little to the side, slowly waved his hand at himself and in his own manner, said that they could attack him 3 together. Kyle offered them a fight. Kyle stood up resolutely, confidently looking at his prey, in the face of 3 scum. The students surrounding them in the dining room began to loudly discuss what was happening. More and more students surrounded Kyle and the 3 guys. They all discussed that Kyle had no chance of winning against 3, especially the strongest of 10-1 and 10-2. Some guy looked down on Kyle and asked if he thought Kyle would lose to two of the strongest dogs, and even 3 against 1. Brett, standing next to him, looked at this guy and began to reflect that he did not think that Kyle would lose, even if they surrounded him with the 3 of them. Continuing to calmly peer at Kyle, Brett noticed that compared to those 3 dogs, Kyle looks much calmer. And indeed, Kyle stood calmly and looked at the garbage without an emotional look, keeping his hands in his pockets. It was obvious from him that he had not lost his fortitude, and these 3 were just showing off. The 3 dregs continued to press on Kyle, feeling the advantage, because there are 3 of them. Brett came to the conclusion that he did not yet know how this fight would end, but noticed that Kyle was so fearless that his calmness was even frightening. But still, Brett believes that Kyle will win. Shouts and loud conversations could be heard even outside the dining room. Such a noise could not be unnoticed. The dean calmly walked down the street and ate bread. Passing by the dining room, she saw crowded students in the window. It seems she was interested in it. She recognized them. They were guys from 10-9. They had been calm lately and now it started again. An evil smile appeared on her face. She said that what a charm they were, young and big cuties. Behind the 3 dregs, Kyle saw the outline of a very familiar figure in the window, even if it wasn't her. But when he saw her completely, he realized it was the dean. Kyle could easily knock out the 3 of them, because they came under the pretext of revenge. But he knows that they came just to show their strength and get their hands on 10-9. Sweat broke out on Kyle's face. His plans were falling apart. He could get his hands on half of the sophomore classes right now, but becoming a regular in the dean's office would limit his ability to defend Harper. Looking back at Harper, he realized that he needed to decide everything right now, whether to fight them right now or later. The strongest dog from 10-1 shouted furiously to Kyle to stop staring at him like that and swung hard. Hit. Kyle easily dodged, but still not without damage. The discard grazed his nose. But that wasn't what surprised Kyle. Kyle, shocked, looked out the window. But he was shocked not by the blow, but by the fact that the dean calmly turned around and left. He realized that this was his chance. After leaving, the dean with an angry voice said that the boys should continue, because now is the time. Her fist clenched hard. Kyle, confident in himself, made a lunge to have a big foothold and moved to the trash to make a retaliatory strike. But something held his action down. 2 friends smugly held Kyle's hands and did not let him move. Chuckling, they asked him not to forget about them. Kyle's face wrinkled with anger. He imagined everything quite differently. He had a bad feeling. The strongest dog from 10-1 was already flying at Kyle at full speed. He shouted furiously for Kyle to taste his uppercut. The blow went through a vast area of the chin. Blood splashed to the side, and a dull sound of a blow sounded in the dining room. The blow was strong. The discard hit the right place. Kyle's consciousness left him and he fell to the floor. Everyone was looking at the fallen Kyle enthusiastically. The strongest dog from 10-1 squatted down, complacently and arrogantly looking at the lying Kyle. He said that he was an ordinary loser. His friends enthusiastically discussed that the dog from 10-1 had definitely dislocated his jaw. The 3 scum headed for the exit. The crowd parted in front of them. Passing through the students, they showed off that no one had survived Sean's uppercut yet, and he even took 2nd place in national boxing competitions. The dregs have dealt with the most problematic class 10-9. Now the high school students will definitely take care of them. Suddenly the whole crowd screamed again. Kyle began to rise. The dregs turned around in confusion and could not believe what they had heard. The dregs turned around. They were completely confident of their victory. Kyle stood up to them. Suddenly, Kyle makes a sharp lunge and launches his punch right into the face of the strongest dog from 10-1. The sound of the blow fills the dining room. The friends of the garbage did not have time to blink an eye as their friend tipped over backwards and fell heavily to the floor. His slipper flew up to the ceiling. The strongest dog from 10-2, shouting enthusiastically, rushed at Kyle. Kyle immediately reacted to this and prepared to take the hit. Kyle managed to react and intercepted the garbage. Kyle hit him in the stomach with all his might, causing him to bend. The face of the dog from 10-2 was filled with pain. He thought that he had been turned inside out. It was so painful. He fell senseless to the floor. Blood gushed from his mouth. Kyle turned around and looked at the guy he knocked out this morning. He was shaking with fear. Carol exclaimed enthusiastically that Kyle had defeated 3 at once and asked Harper to watch. Harper was in shock. He didn't think Kyle was that strong. Kyle ignored the 3rd discard and went to the body of the dog from 10-1 lying on the floor. The dog from 10-1 was lying, showing no signs of life. Kyle stepped on his hand with force, from which the dog immediately woke up. Multicolored lights sparkled in front of his eyes. He still hadn't moved away from a strong knockout. Kyle looked into Tom's eyes with a stony stare. The discard was now shaking all over with fear, and averted his eyes from Kyle. Kyle came to the conclusion that there was no point in hitting a guy who didn't want to fight anymore. It's over. Kyle took his foot off the asshole's arm and said that if he didn't want to embarrass himself even more, then let him not get up and lie down like that until the end of lunch. Glancing at the third guy, whom he knocked out first in the morning, he warned in a steely voice that if he didn't want to be beaten, he had to get out. The guy shook with fear and stared at Kyle in horror, trying to digest what he heard as much as possible. Realizing that he was being given a chance to leave, he turned around and ran screaming out of the dining room. The students in the dining room cheered. Kyle managed to get his hands on 3 classes in such a short period. It was a new record. The strongest dog from 10-1 began to struggle to get up. He wiped the blood from his face and admitted that Kyle was very strong. But their fight was not over yet. The dog reached into his pocket to get his trump card in this battle. Taking the knife out of his pocket, he licked it contentedly and felt the confidence begin to saturate his body. Shouting furiously for Kyle to die, the stronger dog 10-1 ran after Kyle, who was leaving the dining room. Kyle turned his head sharply and saw an idiot rushing at him with a knife in his hands. The strongest dog from class 10-1, shouting enthusiastically, ran at Kyle with a knife. All the students watching this were shocked. The crowd was buzzing loudly and it was difficult to make out at least some words, but Brett was able to shout over everyone. He shouted at Kyle to be careful because he had a knife. Kyle, hearing Brett, turned around sharply, but did not have time to react. The stabbing grazed Kyle's cheek and left a small cut. Complacently twirling a knife in his hands, the strongest dog from 10-1 shouted for Kyle to attack or he would rip his stomach open. The dog struck again. Kyle's heart beat wildly, driving the blood through his body. Kyle made a slope to the side, moved to the front with a quick jerk and found himself in the face of a dog from 10-1. The strongest dog from 10-1 did not even have time to react. Seeing Kyle so close, fear appeared in his eyes. Kyle took the dog firmly by the wrist of the hand in which he held the knife. Kyle pulled the dog's hand towards him and held the knife to his throat. Without letting go of the dog's hand so that he could not remove it, Kyle said in a firm and confident voice that he cut. Kyle shouted furiously that since he threatened to cut open his stomach, so let him cut and quickly. Kyle said he knew the dog had never cut anyone before. Kyle continued his monologue while the confused dog stood and looked at his hand. Kyle kept telling him to cut. The tip of the sharp knife touched Kyle's neck. A thin trickle of blood flowed down his neck. Seeing this, the dog fell into a stupor. The dog's hand shook violently. He could no longer hold the knife in his hands. His hand began to gradually lower and finally, the knife fell to the floor. The dog looked down at the floor in confusion and fear. Kyle said he was just a kid because he wasn't a man, since he couldn't answer for his words. Without letting the dog come to his senses, Kyle hit the dog right in the face with all his strength. Blood splashed in different directions. From such a crushing blow, the dog immediately rolled his eyes and sighed, tipped over backwards. His unconscious body fell to the floor. Kyle repeated his words again that if the dog does not want Kyle to beat him again, then let him lie there until the end of the call. Otherwise, he will not be well. The crowd of students was shocked. The transferred student knocked out 3 at once. Carol jumped happily, and Harper breathed a sigh of relief. The speakers hanging on the wall said that there were 10 minutes left until the end of lunch, and that all students should go to their classes and get ready for the next lesson. Harper pulled Kyle along. He excitedly asked Kyle to go with him, because it's only their first day, and he's already in trouble. Kyle jerked his hand away. He told Harper to go by himself, and he had one more thing to do. Harper looked after Kyle with surprise. He did not understand what else he could of such a case. There is not a single student in the corridor. Everyone is sitting in their offices and waiting for the lesson to begin. Kyle confidently walks down the empty corridor. Kyle approaches the door of class 10-3 and pulls on the door handle. The door opens quickly and noisily. The dregs from class 10-3 looked discontentedly in the direction of the opening door, but Kyle appeared there. Kyle stuck only his head in the classroom and asked if there were people in it who were against Kyle taking over class 10-3. The strongest dog of class 10-3 was horrified when he heard this, but he could do nothing and submissively lowered his head into the textbook. Without waiting for an answer to his question, Kyle realized that this class was also his now, and loudly closed the door. Kyle walked up to class 10-4 and opened the door. The strongest dog sitting on the first desk looked at the doorway with displeasure. Kyle walked into the classroom and approached their strongest dog. The dog became nervous and fearfully lowered his head into the desk. Kyle grabbed the scum by the forehead and lifted his face up. Looking into the face of the trash, Kyle asked if he was the strongest dog from class 10-4. The garbage nervously began to mumble something. Kyle didn't want to waste any time, so he squeezed the trash's head hard and loudly demanded an answer to his question. The dog answered with fear that yes. Closing his eyes in fear, the dog shook. He told Kyle that he didn't want to fight him and that he didn't mind Kyle taking his place as the strongest dog of class 10-4. Kyle let go of the former strongest dog and headed out of the classroom. Before leaving, he turned around and said that since he didn't want to fight with him, then there was no need to stare at him and what the class 10-4 captures. Kyle walked calmly down the hallway. He captured grades 10-1, 10-2, 10-3, 10-4, and 10-9. He has only 5, 6, 7, and 8 left to capture. The bell for the lesson rang. The microphones hanging on the wall started talking again and said that all students should return to their classrooms. Kyle was on his way to capture the remaining high school classes. Starting tomorrow, he planned to start capturing the younger ones. In class 10-4, the former strongest dog was fidgeting nervously in his chair. He was quickly typing a message on his phone. The trash informed Chris that Kyle had taken over all the sophomore classes except 5, 6, 7, and 8, and that he couldn't stop him. In response, he received a message saying that all members of the second-year gang should skip class and urgently gather on the roof. A teacher came into class 10-4 and went to his workplace. He calmly looked around the classroom. The former strongest dog of this class raised his hand up. The teacher paid attention to him and asked with disbelief what he wanted. Garbage loudly said that he very urgently needed to go to the toilet and got up from his seat. The teacher sternly said that there was already a bell for the lesson. The dog replied that he needed to go to the toilet urgently and that he could not restrain himself. The dog looked reproachfully at the teacher and threatened that he would now do it right in the classroom. From surprise, the teacher fell into a stupor. Looking at the disgruntled teacher with a challenge, the dog threatened him that he was already taking off his pants. He reached for the belt on his pants. The teacher was even more horrified. The dog began to moan that he couldn't stand it anymore and was about to shit himself. The class burst into laughter. The dog stood and waited for the teacher's reaction. The teacher lifted his glasses and looked at him thoughtfully in response. They stared at each other. The teacher turned his eyes to his magazine and told the trash not to go anywhere else and come back as soon as possible. The dog got up and headed for the exit, and the teacher told the rest of the students in the class to open page 17. The dog opened the door of his classroom and stepped into the hallway. Other former strongest dogs of class 10-1 and 10-2 were already walking along it. He left the classroom and followed them. In class 10-9, the dean taught the lesson. She drew something on the blackboard and said that there was no difference between men and women, that the more developed the country, the less difference in education of the two sexes. She turned around, leaned on her desk and said that this is why it is impossible to discriminate against people on the basis of gender, but everyone should be accepted. She was interrupted by some student and exclaimed that it was some nonsense, and that he had not seen a woman who works at a construction site more than once. He also asked why only men work in dangerous jobs. Doesn't that prove sexism? A satisfied smile swept through the class, pleased that the student was able to catch the teacher. The dean suddenly yelled at them all to shut up, because they just have to memorize everything that is given in a textbook approved by the Ministry of Education. The students were shocked by this turn of events and fell silent. Having achieved her victory, the dean looked around the class with satisfaction. Brett was sitting quietly when he felt the vibration of his phone. He put his hand in his pocket. Groping for the phone, he took it out and peered at the screen. The guy from the next desk also received a message, and he reached for his phone. The message said that Brett and Hunter from class 10-9 went out and climbed to the roof of the school. Hunter leaned forward and whispered to Brett that they were being summoned. Hunter will go out first, and Brett will follow him. Brett looked at Hunter with his emotionless gaze, lifted his chin higher and tipped over on the back of his chair. Hunter was furious with this attitude towards himself. Gritting his teeth, he thought that he would not let Brett get away with it. He glared at Brett. Suddenly Hunter groaned loudly and longed for the whole class that he had a very bad stomach ache. Everyone in the class turned around in surprise and began to look at Hunter. The dean shifted her gaze to him with displeasure. She shouted angrily at Hunter, asking him what had happened. Hunter was on his stomach, sweat breaking out on his face. He pitifully asked to go to the infirmary, because the milk in the dining room had turned sour after all. Seeming to understand what was going on, the dean looked at Hunter with displeasure and asked if he was pretending. Hunter, feigning bouts of pain, quickly got up from his desk and loudly exclaimed that no. The dean calmly, but still harshly warned that if he left the school and returned drunk, she would kill him. Still holding his stomach, Hunter turned his head a little, trying to hide his anger in his eyes, because she was simply wasting his time. Pleased that she had made fun of the student, the dean chuckled and said that it was clear from his face that he needed to go out and asked him not to linger. Feigning a sick gait, bouts of pain and twisting his face, Hunter quickly walked around the classroom, hoping that she would not detain him anymore. After waiting for Hunter to hobble to the classroom door and finally get out, Brett stood up silently. The whole class paid attention to him. Brett came out from behind his desk and, with his hands in his pockets, walked calmly to the exit of the classroom. The dean noticed this and watched him go. Two students began to discuss what was happening and came to the conclusion that it seemed to them that high school students were being called. And if only good fighters were being called, then the Red Dragons had reopened the gang recruitment. The dean was furious at such impudence and tried to restrain her emotions, squeezing the edges of the desk with her fingers more and more. Veins bulged on her face. Walking past the last desk where Kyle and Harper were sitting, Brett looked at them out of the corner of his eye. When Brett reached the door, the dean suddenly exploded and shouted loudly for him to stop and where he was going. Not wanting to come up with excuses to get out, Brett turned to the dean and told him that he had the same thing as Hunter. The dean could not contain her emotions because of such brazen behavior towards her and, not believing Brett's words, shouted for him to answer the question. Sighing heavily, Brett asked the dean to stop asking so many questions because she infuriates him. He looked at him defiantly and said that if she wanted to punish him for wanting to go to the toilet, then he agreed to look at it. Brett, confident of his victory in this verbal confrontation, looked down at the dean with a challenge, a little from above, and waited for her answer. The dean lowered the volume of her voice and calmly said that taking care of her students is normal for teachers. Brett reached for the door and quickly slammed it open. He replied that he could take care of himself. Brett stepped into the hallway, but the dean said that as long as Brett is within the school, she is responsible for him. Brett stopped in the aisle, crossing her arms over her chest. The dean said with a malicious smile that she was trying to take care of what was in his pants. The dean said she was worried that Brett wouldn't hurt his delicate, clean skin. Brett was a little shocked by what he heard, but realized that this was his chance. All the students, hearing the dean's words, looked at her strangely, realizing that the teacher should not say such a thing. Brett turned his face and tried to answer something. Pulling himself together, Brett said in a calm voice that he could take this as a bad joke. Hearing Brett's phrase, a noise arose in the classroom, consisting of giggles and smirks. The students spun around, looking at Brett, then at the dean. Brett decided not to stop and added that he had heard some teachers at their school call male students young and big and also make obscene comments after them. Brett asked the dean if she was one of those teachers, too. The dean was horrified by what she heard. Her eyes widened and her teeth clenched. Brett, looking at her with the look of a hero, said that he could not close his eyes to such injustice, and that the only thing his father taught him was not to keep everything to himself and fight for what you think is right. Brett asked why the dean continued to behave badly. Giggling nervously, the dean waved her hand and said that this was some kind of misunderstanding and she did not understand why she would do such a thing. Realizing that she had nothing to say to Brett, she pulled herself together, lowered her gaze into the textbook and said that Brett could go to the toilet, and the others should open their textbooks. Brett, proud of his victory, went out and loudly closed the door behind him. The dean was furious that the student won the verbal altercation and glared at the door. He definitely won't get away with it. Harper turned to Kyle and whispered, so that the dean wouldn't hear, that he and Carol also drank milk at lunch. Harper asked if Kyle had been drinking milk and if he thought Brett was lying. Kyle calmly looked at Harper and said that soon they would find out if Brett really needed to go to the toilet or if he was hiding something. Harper, confused, asked what Kyle meant. Kyle, thoughtfully, replied that he suspected that a group of guys were preparing some shit against him to get rid of him. Harper exhaled with excitement. Kyle looked towards the door and said that 3 of the strongest dogs from the Red Dragons, who control all the others, would soon appear. Kyle added that he definitely needs to go and follow Brett to find out who these 3 strongest dogs are. The stairs of Hong Jin School. Many steps of the strongest dogs of the senior classes can be heard along the corridors. Chris and Sam are waiting on the roof for everyone to climb. Sam asked when Bao would be back at school. Chris replied that he thinks that Bao will not return soon, because if he is suspended again, he may be expelled and then it will be more difficult for him to do whatever he wants. Sam noticed that Bao has been cooling off for too long and it will soon be more difficult for them to manage them. Chris turned around and replied that Bao was busy with other things outside of school that would ensure their future, which meant that they needed to try while he was away. Chris leaned his back against the fence and said that since Bao is not there, it turns out that he trusts them. Sam averted his eyes and wondered what they would do now. Chris said, "We need to stop this Kyle. We can't let him take over all the junior classes." Sam looked at Chris and replied that they already had no one to use from the second courses, because half of them had already been destroyed. Chris knew that they had a trump card up their sleeve and cunningly said that they could use their alliance. Sam asked if Chris was referring to the second-ranked young school. Sam asked if they would help them even if Bao wasn't here. Crossing his arms over his chest, Chris said they could try to convince Young that their success would play into their hands. Sam, apparently not able to think and make plans at all, was surprised to ask how they would do it. Chris replied that they could exempt them from the tax for 3 months and guarantee them autonomy. Sam agreed that it sounded good. Chris slyly looked at Sam and said that Jang already knew what Bao was and it would not be easy for them to get rid of the fear of him, and they would throw them a big piece of meat, which they definitely would not refuse. Sam agreed with Chris, saying that their brain is Chris and he will just listen to him. Hearing footsteps on the stairs, Sam said to be quiet, because people had come. The bodies of high school students began to appear from the doorway. They got up and stood in front of Sam. Sam loudly asked if all the members of the second-year gang had come. Since everyone, he demanded a greeting from them. The dogs standing in 2 rows obediently bowed and loudly wished Chris and Sam a good day. The speakers on the wall started playing and informed the students that recess had begun and they could rest a little. Harper asked Carol what she thought was going on. A little confused about what exactly Harper was asking, Carol asked if it was about Brett and Hunter. Carol thought about it and replied that they usually meet on Wednesdays, but there are also urgent meetings here and there. There's probably an emergency meeting today because of Kyle. Harper looked anxiously at Carol and asked why. Carol enthusiastically replied that this was because rumors were spreading that Kyle had captured half of the second year, and they did not know when he would switch to high school students and decided to strengthen protection. Harper looked at Kyle and said he was a local star here now, and that was cool. Kyle just looked at him in response. Kyle was sitting with his feet up on the table. He asked if Harper had ever seen a tiger playing with cubs. Kyle added that he didn't care about them. Harper looked at Kyle excitedly and said he was only concerned about his safety. A blush appeared on Harper's face. Harper shyly averted his eyes to the side and also excitedly asked if Kyle was sure he could beat them. Looking down at Harper, Kyle said that he had never lost fighting in the woods, and it didn't matter who his opponent was, human or animal. Kyle turned away from Harper. Harper was amazed by Kyle's coolness, and in his head he would decide that he would take his watchdog's word for it. Meanwhile, on the roof, Sam explained that the reason they were all called together was very simple. Sam said that Young High School should help them in reining in a transferred student from class 10-9, Kyle Yun. Sam ordered the dogs to go to Young High School and tell them that they would exempt them from taxes for 3 months and guarantee their autonomy, but in return they had to kill Kyle. After examining the dogs standing in front of him, Sam asked who wanted to go to Young High School and give them their message. Hunter turned his eyes away from Sam, raised his hand and began hesitantly trying to draw Sam's attention to him. Sam looked at him angrily. Hunter said that he and 2 of his friends recently fought with Kyle, and Kyle won. Hunter asked if they had any chance of defeating him. The other dogs stood silently and nervously. Hunter kept saying that Kyle wasn't human, but a monster. Hunter also said that when he was transferred, he heard that Bao captured the entire second year in 1 day. Finally, Hunter came to his main question. He said that Kyle manages to do it much faster. Does this mean that Kyle is stronger than Bao? He also added that rumors about Kyle are already all over the school, and asking a school that is below their rank for help is a shame. After hearing everything Hunter said, Chris and Sam were furious, because with these words he understates the authority of Bao. Hunter, realizing that it would not be sweet for him now, began to turn his head nervously, looking for support from his friends. But everyone was silent. Meanwhile, Sam, silently and slowly moving towards Hunter. It seems now someone will answer for his words. Approaching Hunter, Sam glared at him and asked if he was finished. Hunter wanted to say no, but he couldn't. Sam looked at Hunter with eyes full of anger. Hunter, seeing Sam's face, was horrified with fear and could not say a word. Sam asked if Hunter had anything else to add to what he had said earlier. Hunter obediently lowered his head and replied with fear in his voice that he didn't want to add anything and would shut up right away. Sam raised his huge hand high up, preparing it for a blow, and said that then Hunter should answer for all the nonsense he said. Sam hit Hunter right in the face with all his strength. Hunter immediately bent over from the pain. The unpleasant sound of a blow resounded on the roof. Sam's blow was so crushing that Hunter's consciousness immediately left his body, and he felt himself falling into the abyss. Blood sprayed in all directions, and Hunter's unconscious body fell to the roof floor with a thud. All the dogs standing on the roof were shocked by such a blow, and did not think that Hunter would be able to get up after this. But Hunter was not as simple as everyone thought. Exhaling heavily, he raised his face and leaned on his hands to get up. But Sam didn't want to leave the case unfinished, and he stepped on Hunter's fingers with all his strength. Hunter felt a sharp and severe pain in his fingers, which intensified every second. He tried to restrain himself, but could not, and a cry of pain echoed within the roof. Still standing and pressing Hunter's fingers, Sam said that no one can take Bao's place. He has no equal. Sam went on to say that Bao is a living legend of Hong Jin High School and the Red Dragon Gang. When he finished speaking, he shouted furiously, asking if it was clear to everyone. The dogs, still standing side by side in a row, obediently, at the same time and loudly answered Sam that they understood everything. Hunter, sitting on his knees, held his still aching fingers, trying to restrain the pain. He replied in a strangled voice that he also understood. Sam, hearing Hunter's answer, looked at him intently. Sam didn't like the intonation and asked Hunter what kind of expression it was and did he still disagree with it. Sam walked over to Hunter, who was sitting on his lap, took his collar and lifted it to his face with one light movement. Hunter hung helplessly on Sam's arms and realized that he couldn't do anything. His noses trembled with approaching fear. Sam, who was not satisfied with the lesson he had taught Hunter, shouted with anger in his voice that he should answer his question right away. Hunter, hanging in the air, coughing from shortness of breath, nervously apologized. He said that he would never speak like that about Bao again. Sam, planning to hold a couple more educational receptions, asked Hunter with displeasure if he was sure of what he had said. Realizing that Sam might overdo it, Chris went to Sam's side and told him that Hunter had had enough. Sam immediately stopped his bullying and released his hands. Hunter flew down to the floor and fell painfully. Sam turned to Chris and they looked at each other. Hunter, restraining the pain in his body, slowly crawled away. The dog, with whom Hunter was friends, helped him up and supporting him by the hand, helped him get off the roof. Brett was looking at Hunter from the side. Walking friends were told that they had heard that they were close, which means that the two of them and Brett can go to the high school together. With discontent and apprehension, Hunter's friend asked if they really had to go there right now. Chris looked in their direction and ordered in a commanding tone that they should go there right now. Adjusting his glasses, Chris looked at them with displeasure and asked what was the matter. Was it really so difficult for them to deliver a message to Bao? The dog, hearing the threat in Chris's voice, immediately hurried to bend down and answer that it was a great honor for him to carry out Bao's orders. Satisfied with the answer, Chris turned around and walked to the edge of the roof. Sam saw the dogs with his eyes, and Chris, looking down from the roof, said that they would report to him about how everything went before the end of lessons. The dogs answered loudly and simultaneously that they understood. Brett, Hunter and the dog from 10-2 set off at a slow pace to leave the school. Approaching the fence, Brett drew attention to the watchman. Fortunately, he was asleep and they would not have to invent excuses to get out. Walking down the street, the dog from 10-2 asked Hunter how his shoulder was, because he saw him fall on him. Hunter stretched his shoulder with an unpleasant feeling and replied that it hurt wildly. Hunter said Sam was a lot stronger than he thought. The dog from 10-2 paid attention to Hunter and turned his face. Hunter added that he didn't seem to have met anyone stronger than this jerk. The dog from 10-2 grinned and looked at Hunter and said that Sam was still their high school student, and that Hunter should not talk about him behind his back. Hunter crossed the corresponding sign with his hands and exclaimed that Sam had gone to hell. Hunter looked at his friend and said he would gather the guys while Bao was away. The dog looked at him with incomprehension. Hunter said that if he captured the Red Dragons, he would allow him to be his right-hand man. The dog laughed and asked if his lip would crack. The dogs came to the gate of the Jiang school. They began to decide how they would get there. There was an offer to climb over the fence before the guards noticed them. Brett said that the guys from the baseball team are the strongest dogs of the gang of the highest young. Their team took last place in the competition, and they never go to class, which means they hang around somewhere nearby. Hunter was surprised to ask how Brett knew so much about the higher jungle if he had never gone to it. Brett explained that he was thinking of going into sports, since he had given up on studying and was looking after schools with good sports teams. Hunter remembered with a grin that Brett had actually played baseball in high school. He asked Brett why he stopped. Was it really because of the girl or was he swollen? Brett looked back with displeasure. Brett turned and looked at Hunter with eyes full of anger. He told him that it was none of his business. Hunter hastened to reassure Brett by saying that he understood everything and should not look at him so menacingly. They walked through the streets and looked around. The dog from 10 minutes 2 said he doesn't see anyone from the higher Jiang. He suggested that they split up so that the search would go faster. They split up and Brett went alone down the street. He walked and carefully examined the streets. When he reached the vending machines with toys, he heard screams and scolding. Brett saw someone yell at a junior high student that where was he staring at. The elementary school students had a lump in their throat. They turned around in horror and began to run away. The scumbags in sports uniforms stood and were proud of the educational work done on the younger ones. One of them swore and said that today was definitely not his day, because he managed to lose absolutely all the games. Brett came out from behind the alley and stood in front of them. Two scumbags were surprised and one of them, after appraising Brett, asked his friend what kind of fat guy he was. He shouted to Brett and ordered him to come to them. The scumbag, full of self-confidence, smiled slyly and asked Brett if he had money with him. The second scumbag also made a satisfied grin, supporting the initiative to get hold of money. Brett glared back at them.